Good afternoon. If I can call everyone to find your seat, we'll get started in just a moment. Good afternoon. I am Randy Fiorini, the chairman of the Delta Stewardship Council, and also serve as the chairman of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. So it's my privilege to welcome DPIIC members, DPIIC agency staff members, stakeholders, audience here in the room, and those that are following on the webcast. It's an honor to call to order this 8th meeting of the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee. We first met 3.5 years ago in April of 2014. Since then, we have convened every 6 months to discuss administration priorities and discuss how to implement best available science and best management practices intended to improve statewide water supply reliability and ecosystem conditions in the Delta. This committee plays a unique and important role in increasing the level of cooperation between federal, state, and local agencies on priority actions in the Delta. The committee is called out in the Delta Reform Act, described in the Delta Plan, and is specifically highlighted in the Governor's California Water Action Plan. This is one of the few venues that exist to help further the sustainable management of the Delta by creating a public dialogue about important initiatives, and in particular discussing new opportunities for coordinated state and federal interagency action in the Delta. It is an honor to have all of you here, and I look forward to the updates on progress we will receive and to our discussion today. Some of you have been here for each of the previous 7 meetings. Today, we would like to welcome several new members. Austin Ewell with the Department of Interior, Barry Tom with the National Marine Fisheries Service, Dr. John Calloway representing the Delta Science Program, Federico Barajas from Reclamation, and Grant Davis, Director of the Department of Water Resources. This committee has a track record of success. When faced with successive years of drought, you agreed to appoint one of your agency's high-level representatives to serve on a work group to identify high-impact, near-term science needs. Known as the Delta Agency Science Work Group, this group identified gaps in our scientific understanding that were not currently being addressed. That group meets regularly, and you will hear more about their continued progress. As a direct result from discussions at the May 26 DPIIC meeting, our committee supported an effort last November, the Science Enterprise Workshop, that brought in experts from across the country to discuss how they manage, fund, and communicate science for effective management of ecosystems. Benefiting from the lessons learned in other parts of the United States, the DPIIC endorsed results gained from the workshop and affirmed to use the main concepts as guiding principles for our work here in the Delta. At our meeting in April of this year, you encouraged us to continue to pursue greater collaboration on integrated ecosystem modeling efforts and agreed to participate in a structured decision-making pilot project recommended by Reclamation. You will be receiving progress reports on those 2 matters later today. Last year, we chose the theme for the DPIIC meetings of One Delta, One Science. Our agenda today builds upon that goal by taking a look into the future and having a discussion about desired future Delta ecosystem outcomes. Today, you're going to hear about the Delta Stewardship Council's work that is underway to amend the ecosystem chapter of the Delta Plan. Since the Delta Plan was adopted in 2013, a lot has been learned, and new Delta Plan recommendations and performance measures are now in order. Your input today will help shape that long-range management plan that is intended to guide state, federal, and local actions to achieve a healthy, restored Delta ecosystem. Throughout today's meeting, I encourage committee members to ask questions of presenters. Additionally, please take advantage of the opportunity to engage committee members in a discussion around this table as we describe our views about what a healthy Delta ecosystem looks like into the year 2050. The collected experience and expertise around this table will foster important recommendations as we try to find solutions to some of the Delta's devilishly wicked problems. I think now I have already identified new members of the committee, but we also have some new alternates. So let's begin on my right, and please introduce yourself, your agency affiliation, and anything else you'd like to share.
Hi, I'm John Calloway. I'm the new lead scientist for the Delta Science Program. I started here in August. So I work for the Delta Science Program as well as the Stewardship Council.
Carl Wilcox, Policy Advisor to the Director for the Delta, sitting in for Chuck Bonham.
Grant Davis, the new Director of the Department of Water Resources, and I would like to thank all the number of staff I've got here presenting today.
Barry Thom, Regional Administrator, NOAA Fisheries, West Coast Region. Happy to be here.
Thanks. Felicia Marcus, Chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, and with me is the Delta Water Master, Michael George.
Hi, Karen Ross, Secretary of the California Department of Food and Agriculture.
Hello, my name is Bill Edgar. I'm the President of the Central Valley Flood Protection Board.
Hello, everyone. I'm Skip Thompson, member of the Delta Stewardship Council and also the chair of the Delta Protection Commission and a county supervisor from Solano County.
Hello, I'm Kristen Peer. I'm the Assistant General Counsel at the California Environmental Protection Agency, and I'm here in the stead of Gordon Burns, the Undersecretary.
Hi, I'm Nancy Wu, Assistant Director from Region 9 EPA, Water Division, standing in for Tomas Torres.
Federico Barajas, I'm the Deputy Regional Director for the Bureau of Reclamation's Mid-Pacific Region. And here with me is David Mooney, who is actually the new Area Manager for the Bay Delta office.
Hello, everybody. This is Paul Souza. I'm the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Regional Director for the Pacific Southwest. Good to see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Chakowski. I'm the Bay Delta Science Coordinator for the U.S. Geological Survey. I'm here for the Regional Director of the Pacific Region, Mark Sogi.
And good afternoon, Chris Trinnell, Special Assistant for Water Policy at the California Natural Resources Agency, sitting in for the Secretary today. It's a pleasure to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Austin Ewell. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Department of Interior, and honored to be included today and share the co-eco goals of water supply and the environment and the collaboration between the state and the federal government, and look forward to continuing the discussion and dialogue. And I've met most of you and look forward to getting to meet the rest of you and participating in this process. Thanks for having me.
Thank you all. And I should also mention Campbell Ingram, the Executive Director of the Conservancy, is unable to be with us. There was a family emergency that arose at the last minute, so our thoughts and prayers go out to Campbell. With us also is our Vice Chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, Susan Tatayan, and Council Member Patrick Johnston, and our Executive Director, Jessica Pearson, I believe, is here as well. Good. Well, since we last met, our DPIIC coordinator, Jessica Law, has been promoted and is now serving as the Delta Stewardship Council's Chief Deputy Executive Officer. During this transition, Jessica has served double duty. In addition to her in-house duties, she has been guiding the preparation for today's meeting. And Jessica, I really appreciate all the work that you have put into making these previous meetings and today's meeting a great success. I'd like to call on you now to provide us with an overview of the meeting and discuss the progress and outcomes since the last time we met.
Thank you, Chair Fiorini. I'm very happy to be here today and very happy to see all of you. Since the last meeting in April, we've made some steady progress on a few key initiatives that we discussed at the last meeting. So at the last meeting, we were encouraged to continue to communicate and coordinate on a few topics, one of which being a synthesis of drought management actions that are being taken, and also increased coordination with the San Francisco Estuary Partnership and the Estuary Blueprint. So we've continued to track these activities and report out interim progress at the Delta Stewardship Council meetings. This past September, Caitlin Sweeney, Executive Director of the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, came and presented to the council members. And then in October, we had a panel presentation from researchers at UC Davis that are working on a drought synthesis report. State Water Resources Control Board, Michael George, the Delta Water Master, was there, and also a representative from the Office of Emergency Services to give a panel presentation on some drought management synthesis activities. We're continuing to work with each of you to track progress on the council's and the Delta Plan's administrative performance measures. So we've been reaching out to many of you and will continue to do so over the next few months, and also in preparation for the Stewardship Council's 2018 review of the Delta Plan. So you'll be hearing more from us next year on that. You'll also hear a few more updates on commitments that we made at the last meeting on structured decision-making and also integrated ecosystem modeling. Dr. John Callaway has really taken a strong leadership role in moving progress forward on integrated ecosystem modeling, and we'll talk a little bit more about that today. So thank you all for being here. We're really looking forward to a productive discussion. That's it.
All right, I think we're ready to move on to agenda item number 2. And I should point out, it has been our practice in the past to leave a small gift for you. We've had coasters, we've had placemats, a map of the Delta, I think was one of our premier swag items that we left behind. Jessica, what's the story on the candy?
Some of us really like dark chocolate.
Okay, great. So enjoy.
It's supposedly good for you. So.
Ready? Okay. All right, so for the main focus of our meeting today, or one of the main focuses, is the Delta ecosystem in 2050. So to kick it off, we're going to have a presentation by Ron Melser, Senior Environmental Scientist at the Delta Stewardship Council, who's leading the council's effort on amending the Delta Plan and the Ecosystem Amendment. So the Delta Plan, when it was adopted in 2013, it set forward policies and recommendations for how agencies working in the Delta should direct their actions to achieve long-term sustainability. A core component of the plan's strategy is laid out in Chapter 4, Protect, Enhance, and Restore the Delta Ecosystem. So this agenda item today, we've broken it into 3 separate parts. So to start, part 1 is an overview of the vision and the approach laid out in the Delta Plan, and a short introduction to how our current amendment process provides an opportunity to address other categories of stressors, global climate change, including sea level rise, and other topics, including beneficial uses in the environment in the Delta. Part 2 will have a different series of presenters, but it will be our progress report and update on the EcoRestore initiative. As you may remember, we do this update at every single meeting, and so we're happy to have that come back again. And then also we'll have a follow-up to the previous meeting's recommendation to continue to pursue simplified permitting approaches to enhance opportunities for restoration. Part 3 of this agenda item is a look forward at the Delta in 2050, both from the perspective of several efforts underway, the Delta Conservation Framework, the regional initiatives in Cache Slough, Central Delta, and South Delta, and of course from your own agency's perspectives. So committee members are certainly welcomed and encouraged to ask questions during the presentations. And with that, let's start on agenda item 2A, the Ecosystem Amendment. Here to present is Ron Melser, Senior Environmental Scientist at the Stewardship Council.
Good afternoon, Chair Fiorini, members of the committee. Excited to be here as well. Let's see, so today I'll talk about, as Jessica remarked, the Delta Plan, Chapter 4, in its current scope. I'll talk a little bit about our planned amendment in terms of the rationale behind it, some of the content that's been developed in the science arena, and then move on to a little bit about outreach and pose some questions that I hope would influence today's discussion and just essentially create some discussion around the ecosystem amendment. So without any further ado, I'll dive in here. The Delta Reform Act underpinned the creation of the Delta Plan. If we look back at the act, we see themes of both conservation biology and landscape ecology, and this is related to biodiversity protection, to recovery of endangered species, and the way that we might approach those objectives. So thinking about issues of connectivity, of functioning ecosystems, of the way that they're arranged on the landscape. We see these themes carried through within the Delta Plan, which was adopted in 2013. The document itself and the chapter speaks to the co-equal goal, the ecological goal of protect, restore, and enhance the Delta ecosystems. It's arranged around 5 key stressors: the impairment of flows, the lack of natural habitats and ecosystem cover on the landscape, impaired water quality from an environmental standpoint, the prevention or the issues and stresses of non-native species as they play out on native species, and then some specific management stressors related to the fisheries. So the Chapter 4 also includes some recommendations, as Jessica pointed out, and then policies that address both the need to improve ecological flows that are aimed at improving the efficacy of where restoration is placed on the landscape, and the protection of opportunities to restore lands within the Delta. So this is a high-level overview of the current content of the plan, the way that it's structured. There have been many pivotal events since 2013. These events span various arenas: planning and implementation of projects. They span the policy arena, and then again, I said earlier, there's been lots of improvements in our scientific understanding around issues related to the ecology of species, to their needs, to climate change. This slide captures an incomplete list of some of those activities. So California Water Action Plan, the public funding available through Prop 1, some of the key work that the San Francisco Estuary Institute has produced, and they've presented prior in a DPIIC meeting on some of that work. So lots of good information out there. Randy also touched on this, or Chair Fiorini. We hope to incorporate these works to synthesize them and where relevant, make adjustments to the current chapter. We also see some emerging topics or issues that could be improved upon in the plan. These include the topic of wildlife-friendly agriculture, of the benefits to humans that would be received through restoration of the ecosystem, and that's related to water quality and air quality improvements, to cultural benefits, to recreation and tourism benefits. So a broad cross-cutting theme to be addressed there. I think EcoRestore has really shown that good leadership and governance can be key in moving forward restoration on the landscape, and so we hope to capture the lessons learned through this program. Green infrastructure and ecosystem services, so building things out so that they benefit society. Again, just some of the topics that we are intending to incorporate in the update. Climate change, always a difficult topic to tackle concisely, but we have a more nuanced understanding of the interactions of stream flow from the Sierras and the Central Valley and how that will interact with sea level rise in the Delta. There's room for update within the plan on topics of climate change, and also framing out the activities that society may take to address these issues. So adaptation, mitigation, how we think about ecological adaptation for species who are also faced with a changing climate. We have a specific interest in addressing best available science and really describing and being very careful about our strategy for adaptive management. And we have some opportunity to review the work of the Independent Science Board and then project implementation at multiple scales. So project level through our covered actions process as an agency, program level work that's been carried out over the past few years related to EcoRestore, and then our science action agenda, and really, again, updating these components of the plan. So those are a few of the topical areas for update. Ultimately, this is sort of a process with lots of moving parts in terms of scope and the mechanics of updating. You know, we will look to review and synthesize and memorialize best available science, and then the cross-cutting topics within the various arenas, so new policy and planning and implementation. One thing with the shift in the state's approach to natural resource management in the Delta, we see a real need to incorporate a fundamental component of conservation planning, which is understanding the needs of species and really understanding the functions that are needed on the landscape. And so the development of conservation targets we see addressing through this process, and putting those together with the planning structure that the Delta Conservation Framework has put together over the past 2 years through a process that has really incorporated the local entities on the landscape in its development. And so over the next 6 months, we'll be working through a public engagement process, through technical analyses and synthesis of information, and updating and presenting to the council both these interim products and then draft content in terms of the chapter and performance measures. One of the things I wanted to touch on was our outreach and engagement. The council's chair and vice chair have been engaged in listening sessions over the past couple months with key stakeholders. There's been staff outreach and coordination with state, federal, and local agencies, with residents and stakeholders and the public. We will have public meetings incorporated into our process. And of course, the CEQA process also opens up an opportunity for review and commenting on the plan and public workshops. So in the interest of spurring conversation for today, again, I think we're really interested in hearing about the ecological outcomes that we should be thinking about in terms of the future, both a short-term future and a long-term vision for the Delta. I think the Act requires us to plan out into 2100, but we also see 2050 and even more short-term goals as important, and really taking action now and being able to understand the planning content that's suggested. So ecological outcomes, in addition to that, strategies for achieving these, so how we might go about that. And last, input on what we should be looking at and understanding the efficacy of this planning document. So how well the Delta Plan is actually guiding implementation of a protected, restored, and enhanced Delta ecosystem. And so understanding metrics and performance measures will be very important in our update process. And that is my last slide. With that, I'll take questions.
Ron, great job of setting the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. Any questions of Ron? I feel compelled to explain that I think the reason this is important is that the Delta Plan is designed to be a guiding document for all of our agencies, and it's a point at which we intersect with common interests in an effort to implement what's called out for in the Delta Plan. So to the degree that you all can contribute to that and to make it as much of your own plan as you can, the better we're all going to be able to do our work. So, Ron, you've set a good foundation for the Chapter 4 in the Delta Plan that already is pretty robust, but as you point out, been a lot of changes, and sea level rise, climate change influences in particular are something that we need to incorporate into the next round. So,
Randy, can I make a quick?
Yes, Chris.
Thanks, Ron. Super helpful and well done. I would just say that from Resources Agency's perspective, one of the many values of not only the ecosystem amendment, but the whole process of updating the Delta Plan every so often as dictated by statute, is that it is one of the few kind of mandated mechanisms whereby we can span administrations with clear articulations of high level, not just high level, but detailed specific plans and visions for restoration and water supply reliability and beyond. So I think we're all aware, where things stand right now with transitions and whatnot, and this is a good opportunity. This is a fantastic opportunity even to really set the tone for whatever comes next. So thanks.
Felicia.
No, thank you as well, and nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
It's a great effort, and I know firsthand how hard it is to do. One of the things I also think would be helpful is be sure to call on us to help, because there's a lot of things we'll discuss through the course of the day where it just makes sense to have it coordinated in one place, or where there's, we're working with a common set of information in the various things that we do. And climate change is obviously a great example of that. Some of the levee work, the work the flood boards, we're all doing work where we're working so hard and we're dealing with our piece of the elephant. And this is our opportunity to sort of see how it fits together. So I would say call on us and force us to be able to either contribute or review your drafts, because here's where we can tell the public how it all fits together, where we work together collectively on things, where it hinges together in different ways, and it's incredible value to have it all in one place. And I know in all of our various documents that all of us do, we try to give reference to the other things that are happening, but there's no way we can do as good a job of explaining how this mosaic fits together and how the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. So call on us to do that, even if you have to nudge us to.
Great. Thank you.
Paul, and then Federico.
Thank you for your work, Ron. Really appreciate it. Just riffing off what we've talked about already today, there's a lot of measures out here that exist that can help this effort. I know you're aware of that. I just love this time of year, and if you've been to a National Wildlife Refuge in the last few weeks, you're seeing them covered up by birds. I got some pictures. Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge, Sacramento National Wildlife Refuge Complex, San Joaquin, San Luis. It's just a great time of year. And we've put a lot of time and energy into coming up with population targets for our migratory waterfowl. So that's an obvious place to start. Threatened and endangered species are another category where we've got just lots of great information for you. You're probably aware we're required to come up with downlisting and delisting targets. We're working really hard when we've achieved success to get species off the list or downgraded from endangered to threatened, so that's another really obvious place. The third category is one that's more new, but I think it's got extraordinary growth potential. We call it at-risk species conservation. These are species where we see the condition becoming more precarious, but we're working proactively to try to identify mechanisms to stop that decline and avoid the need to list under the Endangered Species Act. It requires recovery level engagement of scientists up front Oftentimes, we don't get around to the business of recovery until we've got a listed species. But what we're finding is it's helping to get greater investments in conservation because people will invest more to avoid regulation than they will to be regulated. That's what we're finding.
Right on. Federico?
Yeah, just a quick question. In your remarks, you mentioned that the CEQA process was also going to be an opportunity to look at this. Were you envisioning that this amendment process is going to fall outside of the already covered environmental process and therefore triggering additional CEQA in the process? Just a clarification on that for me.
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, so climate change was not included originally in the plan, or what were I guess I'm trying to figure out what the triggers are that would fall outside the four corners of what has already been analyzed as part of the original plan.
When the plan was adopted in 2013, the Stewardship Council is currently undergoing several amendments right now to other portions of the plan, and we've opened up the CEQA process on those amendments because we have updated baseline information. So with this amendment on the ecosystem chapter, we'll also have updated baseline information from 2013. So that's one of the main drivers, but also it's going to be reviewing the policies and the regulations that are in the amendment. So if there's additional environmental impacts based on those policies, regulations, or recommendations, that's what we're going to be analyzing in the CEQA document.
All right, anyone else? Anything else? Great. It's a good foundation to build on.
Okay.
Next up.
Thanks so much.
2B.
Yep, 2B. So I'd like to invite Chris Turnell to move from one side of the table to the other. Bill Harrell at the Department of Water Resources, who's the lead on the EcoRestore program. And then also I'd like to call up Erica Lovejoy and Eric Schmidt from Sustainable Conservation to come and discuss some work that they're doing on streamlined permitting. Thanks.
Okay, all ready to go, Mr. Chair?
Please proceed.
All right, wonderful. Well, it's a pleasure to be back here today. As I believe Jessica mentioned, there's been an EcoRestore highlight set-aside section in each of the DPIIC meetings since its inception, and just really want to acknowledge that is much appreciated, much acknowledged, and I think, as we'll see today, helps integrate a lot of the different topics that are discussed. So just want to express my appreciation for the continued focus on this program. And with me today is Bill Harrell, Program Director for Department of Water Resources EcoRestore program, and we'll be tag teaming this presentation. Today's presentation is going to be a little bit different than ones in the past. So I know there's several new members, and so that doesn't really mean much to those necessarily, but in the past, what I've at least focused on myself has been generally some specific projects. We usually focus in the YOLO bypass. Where are we specifically with CEQA NEPA? Where are we with construction? You've granted me the ability to go into some pretty good detail on some specific projects because of their overall importance, their sort of symbolic value, if you will, given how challenging they can be in that particular landscape. But today we're going to take a little bit different tack, and I'm excited to do that. What we're really going to be doing today is talking rather about the exciting emergence of landscape-level patterns and opportunities that show how we are collectively on a strong path towards achieving strong, resilient, and functional delta ecosystems. So really taking a step back from the individual projects and saying, if we all look at these with a slightly blurred vision, squinting our eyes a little bit, what does the landscape actually look like? How are the pieces fitting together, and how does that help us transcend the conversation from one of focused on targets and acreages per se to one of functional delta ecosystems, which is something that's consistent with the Delta Stewardship Council's charge, both statutory and otherwise. And I think a lot of the conversation that your agencies and beyond have really been prompting. So that's exciting. As I mentioned, much of the ecosystem, or the existing EcoRestore targets that we'll be talking about briefly today, are driven by hard numbers, right? We have 8,000 acres requirement for tidal habitat restoration from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service pursuant to a 2008 biological opinion. It's a big component of the 30,000 acre objective of EcoRestore. You have the 2009 biological opinion from NIMS, focusing on, at least a part of it, a key part of it, focusing on 17,000 acres of floodplain restoration. That's another huge component of the 30,000 acres for EcoRestore. And those specific acreage targets will, of course, continue, as they should, to be a major driver in these conversations, absolutely, especially when it comes from a regulatory perspective. But I think what gets lost in the conversation sometimes, at least, is the fact that the species that we're all working collectively to recover and steward into a sustainable future don't necessarily, per se, care about the numbers and the acreages necessarily. I would put forward that what the fish and the birds and the upland terrestrial species and others need is a functional delta ecosystem, one that provides adequate food resources, opportunities for refuge, food production, spawning, rearing, safe migration, that are areas that are adequately sized and located, refuge from predators, and beyond. And this gets to really the point of the DWR EcoRestore program, the California Natural Resources Agency's involvement in Cal EcoRestore, more of the umbrella approach to the effort. And that is, again, taking that step back, providing the resources, staff, et cetera, expertise, and saying, how do all the different various pieces of what we are all working on collectively fit together? So that we're achieving the individual targets as we go, but we're also not missing opportunities to make those connections, those linkages, so that ultimately we're driving towards, which I would argue we are, successfully, a functional delta ecosystem, and not just one made up of something that happens to achieve specific requirements along the way. So I won't spend much time on this, but this is just a quick reminder. The original EcoRestore program stemmed from the transition in April 2015 from the Bay Delta Conservation Plan to a two-pronged approach, California Water Fix for the water supply reliability side of things, and California EcoRestore for the habitat restoration side. This is the original articulation of the 30,000 acre objective or target that was laid out in April of 2015. It's important to note that this is a floor. This is not a ceiling. We fully intend to, in the 5 years that EcoRestore has for a horizon, if you will, to blow past these numbers. Lots of progress towards meeting these goals, as Bill will describe in a second. One thing I just want to quickly mention is that if you look at the 1,000 plus acres in the lower right-hand corner that says, sort of the grab bag, it's the aquatic, riparian, and upland habitat projects, multi-benefit, flood management projects, et cetera. Just as an example of how we're treating this as a floor, not a ceiling, the 30,000, is Department of Water Resources is taking the lead on a major multi-benefit flood control project in the Ewell bypass called the Lower Elkhorn Levee Setback Project, Lower Elkhorn Basin Levee Setback Project. It's a flood-driven project primarily. However, it will bring around 900 acres into the Ewell bypass floodplain. And in doing so, open up greater opportunities for that type of habitat restoration. So just that one project alone is around 900 acres of the originally articulated 1,000 goal. So apparently it's challenging for me not to focus on individual projects, but that's an example of one thing where we are really making big strides, really pushing ourselves outside of traditional comfort zones and getting some good work done. So with that, to talk about more good work that's being done, I'll pass it on to Bill Harrell.
Thanks, Chris. Chair Fiorini, members of the board, or the committee, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we jump into some of the maps that you've probably seen in your handouts, I want to give you a quick update on the adaptive management planning activities that have been going on since the last time we described them at DPIIC meeting. So the Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team, or the IMIT team as it's known as, includes agencies and stakeholders and scientists of technical management staff. And they've developed a draft EcoRestore Adaptive Management white paper with recommendations for developing robust long-term habitat restoration management program.
And Bill, if I could interrupt.
Sure.
That white paper is near the end of tab 2B.
Excellent. Great. So I think we kind of rolled that out last time we were here. As an update, currently the IMIT is revising that draft white paper, in response to comments from the Delta Independent Science Board and other science and adaptive management experts. And they expect to get the final approved from the EcoRestore Adaptive Management Steering Committee in early 2018. So that's the trajectory for that. Concurrent with revising the white paper, the IMIT has begun working on implementation of several of the technical recommendations. And Lauren Hastings, I think she's here, with the Delta Science Program, is kind of leading this effort, and she tells me they look forward to making considerable progress on implementing the Adaptive Management Program in 2018 with the help of all of you and your staff. So, and I believe there's a poster in the back too that has the current status on the back. So with that, we'll switch to the next slide and get to kind of the project update that Chris described. So I'd like to turn your attention to the first slide, which is, I think, number 3 in your series of 4 map slides. This depicts kind of where we are on the landscape with EcoRestore projects. So these are the completed or planned projects in yellow on the first map. As you notice, there are many exciting developments since the DPIIC meeting early this May. In addition, you notice an incredible amount of activity in the project tracking sheet, which is that colorful fold-out map that you guys have that shows project by project activity. That's the one with really small font, so I apologize for that, but here's the good part. That small font is directly proportional to the number of projects we have going on. So that's increased quite a bit from the last time we were here. So in this case, the small font really provides positive progress. The projects on that chart are the same projects that are shown on the map that I explained earlier and reflect our estimated milestones for each of the projects in terms of permitting, design, and construction. So it kind of gives you a snapshot of when we think those projects are actually be on the ground. As Chris mentioned, the bulk of the newest projects are really driven by the OCAP biological opinions, and many of them are in the intertidal zone of the Delta. For example, one I wanted to call attention to, and I can't resist either, Chris, is Chips Island. Chips Island is now in 100% public ownership. I don't know if you are familiar with Chips Island at the confluence of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. 75% owned by DWR and 25% by Metropolitan Water District. So we're forming a partnership to do full tidal restoration on that site. Along with the direct acquisitions like Chips Island, we had a request for proposals that solicited turnkey restorations that David Okita mentioned to you last time when he was here. Since then, we've completed contracting with those 2 successful RFP bidders, and those projects are moving forward. And so we expect to see those on the ground in the next 3 years. And one thing to mention, the RFP was really a first of its kind. It was recognized by some national organizations as a very innovative way to engage private investors in a hybrid kind of pay-for-performance type contract. It was the first time we've ever done that. And we're optimistic that we can use that method again in the near future. So if you connect these projects with a couple of the other large, high probability projects that Chris is going to talk about next, the acreage to fulfill the tidal wetland biological opinion requirements is really on the near horizon. We're very close.
Great. So a couple other slides that I'll try to move through pretty quickly because we're probably bumping up against some time here. This map in front of you is, at least I think to us, well, actually, that's okay. I'll stick on this one for a second. So on this one, by itself, it's relatively exciting, right? I mean, what Bill just mentioned is that we are well on our way to meeting the objectives of not only the regulatory piece of EcoRestore, but also our voluntarily derived and pursued restoration projects. But what's even more exciting is if you look at some of the emerging opportunities that are coming out in the landscape. These include multi-benefit flood management projects, including the one that I mentioned, which is the northernmost purple project. It looks like an L, a capital L. The project at the bottom of the screen, Paradise Cut, multi-benefit flood management project with significant floodplain restoration and riparian upland opportunities. You have Central Delta, recent Central Delta Island acquisitions by Metropolitan Water District of Southern California that have tremendous multi-benefit restoration and management potential. We have conceptual plans now for the restoration of the state-owned Franks Tract in the Central Delta, and a couple potential tidal habitat restoration opportunities in the lower Ewell bypass that are large scale, adjacent to existing restoration projects, both planned and in the ground now, and remarkably well located to address multiple public interests and values. So if you just start overlaying, to repeat really quickly, some of the emerging opportunities, you start to see some patterns emerge. You start to see some connectivity, and again, moving towards this image and this vision, rather, of a functional delta ecosystem. This next slide just adds to the layer of interest, I think, in this visual. And this is just simply highlighting some of the existing protected lands that have been protected and are either in public ownership or were protected with public dollars. So again, more connectivity, more connection, more adjacency, more opportunities for getting at that fundamental interest of a functional delta ecosystem. And finally, our last slide here just overlays kind of a conceptual bubble, if you will, of what Dr. Peter Moyle has called the North Delta Habitat Arc. Just if you look at that western and northern portion of the projects highlighted, really what this is looking at is highlighting the importance of this area, restoration in this area, for food production, migratory connectivity, extensive rearing habitat, linking the SF Bay to the Sassoon Marsh to the Western Delta to the Cache Slough Complex, the Cache Slough Complex to the Ewell Bypass, to the greater Sacramento region and beyond. So again, we're actually starting to do this. We're moving out of the realm of scientific paper, saying, wouldn't it be great if we made these connections into a, wow, look what's emerging, both from what we're doing and what's on the horizon opportunities-wise. Last thing I'll just mention is, I don't have a highlighted bubble overlay for it, but it's that other corridor. We call it the Central Delta Habitat Corridor. This is a connection of either privately owned lands that were conserved with public dollars, or the vast majority of it is in public ownership. There's a budding coalition made up of the Nature Conservancy, Metropolitan Water, DWR, CDFW, Resources Agency, BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and others who are actively engaged in looking at, so what do we do with this opportunity? How do we actually move these newly acquired and, to some degree, possibly restored lands, other lands with potential, how do we move that into maximizing its potential? What is that vision? What's the coalition necessary? What is the outreach necessary to make that happen, to local stakeholders who are integral in making that happen, of course? So with that, I'll just conclude by saying that there's a lot of good stuff happening. A lot of good progress is being made. And as we look ahead, again, in the context of the ecosystem amendment update, other efforts that are happening, other efforts that look beyond the original 5-year timeline for EcoRestore, there's some really interesting and exciting opportunities that are emerging. And I think it's simply being teed up, if you will, visually, to put our collective efforts into making real. And I think that it's one of the exciting things about this committee. So I look forward to working with all of you on that, and thanks for the time.
Thank you, Chris. Bill? Bill Edgar, I can tell you've got a question.
No, just an informational one. Chris, what's the that opportunity Half Moon down in the San Joaquin, the lower end? What is that?
Is it possible to put
that little arc?
Yeah, so that is Paradise Cut.
Oh, that's
so
Paradise.
This is a multi-benefit flood project that was highlighted in the recently adopted Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, the 2017 update of the 2012 plan. And it is generally seen as a tremendous opportunity for large-scale multi-benefit flood management investment that could also, if designed correctly, which I think that it can be, help us achieve our broader ecosystem objectives.
Right, thank you.
Any other questions of Chris or Bill? Yes, Paul.
I'll just briefly say, great job. We're going faster than we have in a long time with habitat restoration, and it's wonderful to see. We got to figure out how we keep up this momentum between this investment, Prop 1, other propositions that are being considered. We've got the chance to really go fast. And I've got to say thanks to the state. We got some Prop 1 funding for an important project, Sutter National Wildlife Refuge, for some water conveyance. So we've got to figure out how we continue to use all these tools to keep going this fast.
I want to echo that and say what I have said at previous meetings. This doesn't happen without a plan and a champion. And the EcoRestore plan signed a goal of 30,000 acres in 5 years, and then David Okita and Chris Chernell in particular were assigned to be those champions to carry that forward. So Bill and others have been working diligently. I know, Chris, you wanted to take a broader view of this and not look at it project by project, but our success is measured project by project, and that's why the work that's been done thus far is historic. We've never had this level of activity in terms of restored habitat, and I agree with Paul. We need to maintain this momentum, and hopefully that momentum will come out of this meeting with an agreement of the kinds of things that we need to expand upon based on the successes we've had thus far. All right.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Skip.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would say let's not go too fast. And I appreciate the enthusiasm around the table, but the Delta is not a blank slate. There's a lot going on. There are communities, there are actual people, there are farmers, the ag community are they're cautionary as to what's going to happen. But I'm happy to hear about all the acquisition that the public agencies have acquired. And I guess the ask would be from those of us that represent the Delta is that we ought to think about those properties being developed first for EcoRestore. And because once you start down this path, it makes it very difficult for the ag community to farm next to some restored properties that may be in conflict. So that would be my first ask, that the public lands be looked at first before any other lands are looked at. That you develop a comprehensive regional plan, and I'm talking specifically about the Cache Slough complex. I often say it's ground zero for the EcoRestore efforts, but it does affect those that are surrounding the restoration area. And I will continue to beat the drum about having local involvement. I mean, without local involvement, you're going to have a heck of a fight on your hands. And I say that locals probably know better than anyone what is going on, how they can be helpful. But without their involvement, it is going to be another battle. And Chris and I have had many talks about these issues, and we agree to disagree on many occasions. But I think, to all of you representing agencies, you're trying to do the right thing. Well, the right thing may not always be the right thing for a particular area. So I just ask that maybe we move more expediently than government is used to, but we ought to think about how we proceed. So anyway, thank you.
Karen?
Those are good comments, and I don't know that this is the right place to ask this question, but looking at what the farm community itself has done, I haven't been to the refuges, but I've been through rice country, so I know about the birds. And knowing of the enthusiasm by those same farmers to do for salmon what they've done for birds is really understanding the true opportunities for neighbors to watch what is happening, to weigh in on what's happening, but to also be a part of that so that they're still continuing their productivity. Not all of these projects are going to lend themselves to that, but I'd love to know your thinking if you have identified in this process where some of the neighbors could be doing some similar practices on their ground with some of the incentives that might be available for that.
Let me just jump in very quickly. And Mr. Ross, you're absolutely correct. The Yola bypass is an example of how you can provide for fish during a time that they need the water and also continue to farm. So those are the sorts of things that we hope we can see out of this effort.
Yeah, one thing I would say in response to that question, I appreciate the comment and the question, of course, is that I can fall prey to have a tendency to discuss restoration in kind of least common denominator terms, where it sounds like all restoration is one thing in the Delta. Maybe our minds all go towards salmon restoration, let's say, which can be, doesn't have to be, as the supervisor pointed out, but can sometimes be seen as in conflict with either neighboring practices or practices that are going on there right now. But much of what, not necessarily a majority, but much of what was discussed earlier on that final slide that had kind of the suite of at least overlaid opportunity, what's missing from the detail that's missing from that slide is anything related to what the actual on-the-ground thing is. So there's much of that land, especially in the Central Delta corridor, I would say, and in the Cache Slough region and beyond, where we're actually looking at incorporating wildlife-friendly practices onto the landscape, and that being the objective. That's not a step towards something else, that is the actual end goal, especially where you have lands, or at least, for example, where you have lands that maybe are too deeply subsided to do much with in the near term, at least, in the very, looking a long time out, related to, aquatic restoration. But what can we do there now to increase the wildlife value of it, and therefore blend it into this landscape it's emerging of the restoration perspective. So I think there's a lot that can be done that incorporates all those interests.
Yes, Paul.
I just have to comment on the point that we have to look at multiple different approaches to be successful. Rice farmers in the Sacramento Valley provide so much benefit for migratory waterfowl. I don't know that we'd have the Pacific Flyway that we do today without rice farming in the Sacramento Valley. And them also stepping forward and wanting to have conversations about providing rearing habitat for fish is just a welcome conversation. We're starting to have those conversations now. The question becomes is how do we incentivize the landowners to be able to continue to do this work? It could very well be a different toolbox than some of the ones that we're talking about right now. I had the chance a couple weeks ago to go down to Kern County and celebrate the 20-year anniversary of a Kern water bank. And here we have a water bank that's a groundwater recharge area, benefiting threatened and endangered species and providing water that can go to farmers and communities. It's a triple win. So I felt compelled to pile on and say we need to figure out all of these different approaches and get them pulling in the same place.
Carl? And then John?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out, and thank you, Chris and Bill, for the update. It's heartening to see the progress we're making, given the fact that we were so far behind at one point. So I think part of this discussion about how we engage folks in the process is the focus of the Delta Conservation Framework that we'll be getting an update on here shortly. And I think that, from the department's perspective, has been a key of how we move conservation planning in the Delta, but I think it translates to other areas and really focuses on the incorporation of, as Supervisor Thompson pointed out, the participation of the local community and the Delta community in the efforts that are undertaken and how you move forward with that. The other thing is that, while we look at these kinds of projects in our planning, I think we really, we're talking about 2050. Well, I think we should be talking about 2100 and beyond as far as the relative sustainability of the things that we're talking about. What we're finding out in some of the work that's ongoing is that the Delta is not a static place. As it continues to subside or as sea level increases or climate change, agricultural practices aren't possible in some places. And so we need to start looking at how do we offset those, and that has consequences to terrestrial species that rely on those now. So it becomes a very complicated picture and one that does require a landscape approach, but as well as the engagement of the local community.
John?
Let's see. So I was just going to point out that I think you mentioned ecosystem functions as a way to think about some of the benefits of restoration. I think that might be a way to move away from just acreages to think about all these different benefits that could be provided by different kinds of projects so that we're not just counting acres. So I wonder, is there anything going on currently to address it? I know for the ecosystem amendment, we've been talking about that exact issue of how should the performance measures be set up. And so are there any efforts currently going on to try to compile not just acres, but look at functions in different ways?
I think answering that one way would be that I think that there's many of us, including myself and others at agency, who are going to be leaning on the ecosystem update to do just that. And that, you know, what's emerging is the pattern. What's emerging is the opportunity. What's emerging is, you know, the resources that we have at agency and at DWR and working with all of your, you know, all of our partner agencies and all of you, to not miss those opportunities now, but that documents like the Delta Conservation Framework that Carl mentioned, that CDFW just took the lead on putting together, that you know, and the Chapter 4 Delta Plan amendment, the ecosystem chapter. I think that is where we would certainly like to see, and potentially amongst other places too, but really looking at that as the opportunity to really lay out, what does that mean? What really is a function that we're driving at? How do you measure that? How do you adaptively manage to that and beyond? So I'm not sure that's a great answer for you, except that, you know, I think EcoRestore's purpose right now is to start finding those opportunities and patterns, making sure nothing falls through the cracks, so that we can tee up for efforts like the one that your agency will be leading.
Okay, so we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about this after our break. I'd like to get through the rest of the presentations that were designed to facilitate the discussion, which has been great. Permitting has been an issue, and Erica Lovejoy and Eric Schmidt with Sustainable Conservation have been doing some work in the Central Valley in regards to streamlining of permitting. It seems like there would be a great fit here, and so Erica, are you going to take the lead on the presentation? Thank you. Welcome both.
Hi, everyone. We really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm here again with my colleague, Eric Schmidt, and he's one of the key people on our team helping to lead our permitting initiatives. So many of you know us, but just in case, Sustainable Conservation is a California-based nonprofit that helps to solve some of the toughest challenges facing our land, air, and water. And we work together very closely with businesses and agriculture to help them with environmental stewardship while sustaining their businesses. And we also collaborate very closely with regulatory agencies and restoration proponents on accelerating the pace of habitat restoration by creating policy and regulatory incentives to help get that work done. And so today I'm going to talk a little bit about the need for expedited permitting for restoration. I'll go over our simplified permitting for restoration initiative and the progress, and then how this effort can help increase partnerships between regulatory agencies and project proponents to help accelerate restoration in the Delta. Okay, so of course, one of the primary reasons that brings everybody here today is that we're all collectively trying to address massive declines in listed fish populations and restore lost and degraded habitat. And it's been talked about a lot of the new funding sources and programs that are available to help do some of this work, Prop 1 and others amounting to about $3 to $4 billion, and we may have some potential bonds coming down the pipeline as well. And then we've got drivers like the Governor's Water Action Plan, Delta Plan, EcoRestore, recovery plans, TMDLs, and the list kind of goes on and on, all calling for thousands of acres of habitat restoration. So with that, we have to, that means that we have a lot of different entities that are going to be implementing restoration projects. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do we get all of these projects done in a timely and cost-effective way with more money for on-the-ground work? Okay, so we all know, of course, that a big part of this picture is permitting and how to make that process more efficient while ensuring that appropriate environmental protections are in place. So in order to implement critically needed restoration projects in the Delta in a timely and cost-effective way, it's, of course, going to be really important to have a simplified permitting strategy. And programmatic permits are one of the key tools that Sustainable Conservation uses to help get restoration done, and what we spend a lot of our time working on with our team. And so for those of you who aren't familiar, these are basically a type of upfront approval for specific projects that meet predetermined conditions and include environmental protection measures that are built into the project description. So I'm just going to quickly go over some of the key restoration programmatics that are already available right now to help provide some context for our program and give you an idea how these work. And then I'm going to talk to you about what we're working on in the Delta. So starting from the bottom of the left-hand column there, the Water Board already has a programmatic authorization in place for small-scale restoration projects. And then in 2014, we worked with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to create the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act. Chris knows about this, which basically creates an expedited process for small-scale projects related to the Water Board's permit. In a separate effort, we partnered with the folks at NOAA Restoration Center and the Army Corps of Engineers to acquire programmatic biological opinions from NMFS, National Marine Fisheries Service, along the entire California coast. And then we promptly approached the Coastal Commission and acquired a consistency determination for those projects. So that's been a major time and money saver on the coast, a lot of fisheries projects moving forward. And basically, here's what that NOAA, Corps, and Coastal Commission effort looks like on a map. Okay, so these permits cover projects of all sizes, and NOAA has approved more than 140 projects since this has been in place and have saved thousands of hours of staff time. Okay, and there's more benefits to come from those authorizations. So these permits basically serve as a model for the 4 authorizations that we're working on now that include the Delta. So let me talk to you about that. So at this very moment, we are working on another biological opinion with NMFS and the Corps in the Central Valley. So this would basically complete NMFS Section 7 coverage throughout the state of California for anadromous fisheries. So that's for work in anadromous fish habitat. So that's really great. And this BO will help many of the key Delta restoration projects funded through Prop 1, projects with the EcoRestore program, and many others. Voluntary restoration as well as mitigation projects are covered, as well as multi-benefit projects that emphasize habitat restoration. So thanks to the great partnership between these agencies and the pretty diligent work of NMFS, we anticipate this authorization will be available in May 2018, so in time for construction season 2018. We submitted the BA last week. All right, so back to our big picture table here. So you can see NOAA at the top of this table, along with 3 of the other agencies that are key to Delta project permitting. So we learned from our experience with NOAA that it's a lot more efficient to prepare one statewide authorization than it is to invest in multiple regional permits over time. So our colleagues at NOAA have said to us that if they had the resources, they would have just done one statewide permit. So with that in mind, our newest effort brings together the work we've done with NOAA into a coordinated process between the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and State Water Resources Control Board for restoration projects in the Delta and across the state of California. So without getting into the technical details, these 4 agencies have interrelated permitting processes, and we are working with them to help develop coordinated programmatic authorizations for a variety of restoration project types. And so Eric and I and our other team member, Katie Haldeman, are basically going to facilitate the process, and we'll develop the key permitting documents and environmental compliance documents and coordinate all the agencies. So the great news is that we have gotten initial commitments from these agencies to move forward with this effort. And so now it's just a matter of getting the full support needed to complete the permits by construction season 2020, 3-year effort. So let's talk more about the benefits here. Okay, so programmatic permits, they serve as a great planning tool by providing standardized protection measures and creating more regulatory certainty, which is certainly helpful in getting projects done. And agency staff can save significant time with a more efficient review process. We've heard from the folks at NOAA that the process for reviewing projects is about 75% faster with a programmatic than without. And we've heard from one of the regional water quality control boards that they save about 20 to 50% time on project review efforts. Also for project proponents, similar for them, we estimate that they can save about 25 to 50 of the time typically needed for regulatory approval. And then on a statewide level, over the 10-year life of, which is typical for many of these permits, they could likely save tens of millions of dollars of regulatory approval costs. So that's no small thing. And then for funding agencies with a more efficient process in place with permitting, more grant dollars can be allocated to on-the-ground work. And we all would love to see that. And of course, the combination of these things amount to faster implementation of plans, mitigation, and encouraging more voluntary projects and resulting in accelerated habitat restoration and improved ecological conditions that we'd all like to see. And I would also like to add, just to talk about the supervisor's comment, that with less time spent on some of these administrative actions, we understand there would be more time to be spent working with the local community, doing the additional planning and talking to folks and working on those types of collaborations. So this is going to be an important effort in that regard as well. So here's what we see as the next steps to move this effort through. So first is the agency commitment to a partnership to developing and completing the permits. So there's been tremendous support, of course, from NOAA and the Corps, and now the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the State Water Resources Control Board have made initial commitments to move forward with the statewide initiative, and we're working with their staff right now on a lot of the details, and we just can't thank your agencies enough for this collaboration. It's really great, and we're really looking forward to continuing the work. So this also represents a very positive new approach that puts restoration on a separate, faster permitting track while helping to achieve agencies' missions and goals. Okay, so it really plays a number of roles here. Next, we've realized from experience that it takes a lot more than just developing the permits in order for this strategy to work. It really requires strong agency support with implementation and rollout of the permits, since this is really a new approach for both agency staff as well as restoration proponents, and they're going to need a little bit of time to adapt to be able to realize the full benefits of the permits. And then last but not least, there's a financial investment that is needed in order to see the potential long-term returns for accelerated restoration. And this multi-agency effort is expected to cost about $2.5 million over the course of 3 years. But with anticipated permit renewals, we believe these permits could provide benefits for decades. So that's really important. They are typically renewed. So we're looking to both foundations as well as agencies to help recognize the return on this investment to help complete essential projects needed to restore the Delta and beyond around the state. And we hope that we can count on your partnership, the folks at this table, to move this initiative forward. Thank you.
Erica, very encouraging. Comments, questions? Barry, it seems like you should comment.
Erica, thank you. First of all, I was just going to say thank you for being a great salesperson for programmatic biological opinions.
It's not easy. It's
I should
permitting,
take you on the road. Because we have been trying to emphasize the use of programmatic opinions up and down the West Coast and just the advantages. And you highlighted a lot of those advantages. And I think in this case, it's really interesting to me to, from Chris's presentation, the benefits of setting targets and getting those projects out there, but then on the other hand, you have to get those projects done and get out of the way so those projects can get done. And I think the permitting approaches you've outlined have really helped that. And it allows us, from an agency perspective, for our staff to then focus on more complex, bigger projects that are out there on the landscapes where it does require, where things like restoration, where you can actually have a framework out there where you know what the benefits that are going to accrue, you can sort of step out of the way and let that restoration happen. So just really great to see the effort that's been put into it, and great to have a partnership that's been putting these in place. And it really has been useful. I think that partnership really benefits up front by actually having an agreement of what the projects are going to look like in those frameworks, and that time invested is really important so that we can get these through the process. And once we get this next programmatic done, we'll have the state of California covered for restoration, which I think is a great thing overall. So thank you.
Grant?
I'm going to piggyback on what Barry just said, because he did not comment on one thing that his agency did for us. In my prior position at the Sonoma County Water Agency, they were able to issue the first nationwide safe harbor permit to private landowners who were engaged in actual protection and restoration on Dry Creek up in the Russian River watershed. And I think it's the type of thing that sustainable conservation is known for, and I think it might be something to consider as you look at this wholesale swath of the Delta restoration. I think the supervisor's comments are well taken that in terms of you get as much done as you can, and you need to be working with private landowners in many cases, and sometimes the incentive to provide coverage, if they're willing to work with us on actual restoration, proved to be in a programmatic way very successful. So just wanted to thank you for that, and hopefully we can interpret that here.
Felicia?
I just want to add my thanks. The amount of work it takes to do this, it may seem like we can all do it ourselves, but I know how painstakingly you all ask questions and document every step we go through and then help us figure out how to condense them. I'm understating what is a huge, huge task that you do for all of us, and we've been trying to move towards more general permitting and that sort of thing. When you can, to just, exactly as you say, to free up resources to work on the customized efforts that require that kind of customized effort. So partnership with you on this is a dream come true, so thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chris?
Thanks. Just wanted to, from my perspective at least, put this in a little bit of context. So if my memory serves, the last couple times this committee has met, we've talked a lot about trying to identify, it's always challenging to figure out the right way to say it, but a smoothed process towards what we're all trying to achieve, or at least a component of what we're all trying to achieve, that healthy Delta ecosystem. And a lot of work was put in by staff of the Delta Stewardship Council and beyond to poll each of your agencies and to get a sense for, if we did an honest self-assessment as individual agencies, where could we be doing better? Then the other part of that poll, from what I remember, was where could our sister agencies be doing better, right? So both sort of personal reflection and external. And one of the things that popped out of that, of course, and not surprisingly, was this very issue of how can we work towards a more programmatic approach to the permitting side of this. And the permitting piece of getting these projects done, of course, is by no means the only challenge, but it is an important one to look at. And so it almost serendipitously, here comes sustainable conservation, and who's been doing this work successfully over the last who knows how many years. They probably know, I don't. And
5 on a statewide level.
5 on a statewide level.
20 altogether. 20 altogether.
And 20 altogether.
Yeah.
So I'm just really excited by this opportunity to really mesh and support their efforts, do everything we can to support their efforts, because that's A, the right thing to do, B, in direct acknowledgement of what you all have articulated, and my agency as well, as, again, at least one of the primary challenges to tackle if we want to achieve what we're all trying to achieve. So in that context, that makes really good sense to me, and it's really exciting. So thank you.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Paul?
Well, I'll just simply say we're all in the Fish and Wildlife Service. We look forward to getting it done. I'd like to beat spring 2020, but if that's what it takes, that's what it takes. I know these efforts are difficult. We've had some success in our organization doing programmatics in different parts of the country, but it's a classic case of you need to go slow to go fast. And the challenge that we often face, I know this is true for all of us, it's the tyranny of the inbox. You're dealing with the urgent, and you don't have the luxury of the time to put the capacity together to do these things up front. But that's a wonderful niche that you're helping us fill. So thank you for making it so.
Well, it's a real partnership for us, and we sometimes feel like we can play the role of helping the agencies when staff resources aren't sufficient to get this upfront programmatic work done. So it really is a partnership with the agencies as much as it is with the restoration proponents and project applicants to move restoration forward around the state.
So, yes.
Hi, this is Nancy Wu, familiar with the regulatory process. Sometimes we're the regulator, sometimes we're the funder. So
Yeah.
it's a combination that we're incredibly familiar with. And if you say as it is, that's fabulous, because there are multiple restoration efforts along the coast within the Bay, San Francisco Bay, and Delta that we're trying to fund through our grant funds, and we have tried to work through with the grantee the permitting process. What a nightmare. When is CEQA triggered? When is NEPA? How are we going to do this? How do we consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, NIMS? So we have separate other endeavors that we're doing this as well, trying to work through the permitting process and trying to streamline it. So it will be good if we could combine the various efforts that we are sponsoring that I had not heard about yours until I got the briefing from those guys. So I think we need to combine resources and efforts about streamlining our permitting process, because EPA would be, in totally if we could do this, and not only towards restoration, but other types of permitting, point source permitting, stormwater permitting, on and on and on, that go towards and lends itself to restoration and conservation. So this is fabulous news. I'm excited. One of my guys will call you, one will follow up.
We'll look forward to it.
Well, there you go. The purpose of this, this point on the agenda was to highlight some successes that are underway. And I'm sure Eric and Erica will be happy to talk to anyone around this table who wishes to partner up and become even a greater supporter of their work. Unless anyone else has anything, I'm going to call an end to 2B. Thank Erica, Chris, and Bill for your presentations, and ask the next panel to prepare to come and tell us about planning processes that also express some great successes.
All
So
right.
now we're on to 2C.
2C. So here today we have Dr. Brooke Jacobs, a senior environmental scientist with California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and she is covering two presentations today to help Campbell, who can't be here. So she'll cover the Delta Conservation Framework, and then she'll also discuss restoration work that's going on in the Cache Slough region and a little bit in the Central Delta Corridor. And then after her presentation, we'll have Mike Mearswa from the Department of Water Resources come and talk about the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan and also work that's happening in Paradise Cut, along with John Kane from American Rivers. So.
And then when they're finished, we'll take a break.
Yes.
All right, thank you again for the opportunity to give you an update on the Delta Conservation Framework. This is, I believe, the third update we've given DPIIC about the framework. Carl Wilcox gave an update last April describing the workshops that we held throughout the course of 2016 to develop the framework, and I believe we came to you initially a year ago, last November, to launch the framework. So for those of you who are new and not familiar with it, I'll give you just a brief reminder of what the framework is. And then I'm very excited to say that a public draft of the framework is actually out. It's available on our website. We're encouraging everyone to provide comments and feedback. And so I'll just give you a brief description, a very high-level description of what's in that public draft, but also encourage you and your agencies to give us comments and give us your feedback. We definitely like to hear it. So the Delta Conservation Framework is an effort that was initiated and led by the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And this came out of a commitment by the department following the pivot from the BDCP to California Water Fix and California EcoRestore to pick up the conservation measures in the BDCP that didn't have a home after that pivot happened. So the department made that commitment. In early 2016, we were very fortunate to hire our lead staff, Christina Sloop, who has been the lead and champion for this project throughout the past 2 years. Many of you have met her. And we started off by taking a close look at all the existing and previous planning efforts in the Delta, and then developing a group of close state partner agencies to help us think about how to develop the framework, to help us plan and implement the series of workshops that we ran last year, which really, the workshops were what were used to develop the framework itself, based on stakeholder feedback, participation from agencies, and everyone who came to the table. So the partner agencies, we have their logos up there. The California Natural Resources Agency has been very closely involved, the Delta Conservancy, the Delta Stewardship Council, and also the Delta Science Program, and the Department of Water Resources. We've also partnered with others, but this was sort of the very core group. They've also provided very helpful feedback on the public draft before we released it in September. So the public draft includes a series of very high-level goals that describe the process for planning and implementing conservation in the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta, the Yolo Bypass, and Sassoon Marsh through 2050. So this is a long-term, maybe not 2100, but definitely a long-term perspective on how to plan and implement conservation in this very diverse area. So I'm very excited about this document. I think it's a very novel approach to conservation, and I'm going to show you the next slide, which includes the Delta Conservation Framework's vision for the Delta. And I think that the vision statement really encapsulates the novel components of the framework quite nicely. So the framework envisions in 2050 that the Delta is composed of resilient natural and managed ecosystems that are situated within a mosaic of towns and agricultural landscapes where people prosper and healthy wildlife communities thrive. I just want to take a minute to pull apart the vision statement to sort of explain, at least to me, why this is so exciting and so interesting. So we talk about the need to conduct ecosystem conservation to support healthy wildlife, fish and wildlife communities. We all know that. But the vision statement also explicitly acknowledges the fact that this conservation is going to be done in a place in the Delta where there are already towns. There's already a thriving agricultural economy. People live there, they work there, it's part of their legacy. And when we think about planning and implementing conservation, it really needs to be integrated with what's already in the Delta. And that's an important part of how conservation will be planned and implemented going forward, according to the framework. So the framework is really a call to action. It's a call for all stakeholders at local, state, and federal levels to work together to develop resilient solutions for the future that integrate the needs of all Delta stakeholders with conservation over the long term. So again, bringing home this idea of bringing everyone to the table as a part of a conversation to think about how to do conservation in the Delta and thinking over the long term. So the next few slides are going to go through the 7 high-level goals that are included in the framework, and they're encapsulated by, I think, the 3 primary themes of the framework. So that first theme is people and place, again, hitting on the importance of acknowledging Delta as an evolving place, and acknowledging the people, both within the Delta, statewide, and nationwide, and their input into conservation. So goal A speaks to the need for stakeholder communication and also considering socioeconomic factors when planning and implementing conservation. Goal B speaks to the need for effective public education at the state, national, and local levels. So the need to reach out to locals about the importance of conservation, the need to communicate statewide about the importance of the Delta in the statewide economy and ecosystem, and also nationally. Goal C speaks to the need to consider and seek out multi-benefit conservation solutions wherever possible. This won't be possible in every single place that we do a conservation project, but as we've heard earlier today, there are many good examples of how conservation can benefit both people and the ecosystem. For example, the opportunities to provide wildlife habitat benefits while keeping agricultural activities in place over the long term and integrating those two together through wildlife-friendly ag. Also, floodplain restoration, so we can have flood benefits simultaneous with ecosystem benefits. The second main theme of the Delta Conservation Framework is conducting conservation to support ecosystem function. And this is really the science heart of the framework, and it's founded on a Delta Renewed, the new SFEI publication that you guys have heard about before. So Goal D has a series of strategies and objectives that are pulled directly from a Delta Renewed that focus on improving ecological processes to support ecosystem function over the long term. Again, taking a broader approach, stepping away from an individual species-by-species approach to conservation planning. And Goal E talks about science-based decision-making and coordinated adaptive management. So this really highlights the need to make decisions based on the best available science and the need to support and coordinate adaptive management over the long term, to study those conservation projects that we implement, learn from them, and make decisions over time. The third theme of the Delta Conservation Framework is facilitating conservation implementation and management. And this touches on a lot of the conversations that we just had in the previous presentation. So Goal F is focused on improving the capacity and approaches for project permitting. This is something that we also heard frequently throughout our workshops, is that permitting conservation projects is a hurdle to implementation. So this goal provides specific strategies and objectives for trying to provide ideas to how to use new approaches and also existing regulatory tools to help move permitting through for conservation projects more quickly and more efficiently. Goal G talks about the need to secure long-term funding to support conservation. So it highlights a lot of the existing grant programs through the department and the Conservancy in particular through Prop 1. It talks about other potential sources of funding and also highlights the need for long-term funding to support effective land management of these projects once they're established, and also to support monitoring and adaptive management over the long term. So the Delta Conservation Framework, as you can see, is a very high-level document. These are high-level goals that we feel apply across the Delta, Yolo Bypass, and Sassoon Marsh. It thinks about planning conservation at a landscape scale, but it has become clear through the working with stakeholders and through the workshops that when you really want to get down into the details of how to plan conservation on a parcel-by-parcel basis, that really needs to be done on a regional level. So the last portion of the framework looks ahead to how the framework can be implemented over the long term, or the way forward. And the way the framework presents the highest and best way to plan and implement conservation in these areas is to use regional planning partnerships, where all stakeholders at all levels are invited and encouraged to come to the table to start having conversations about local land uses, local economies, where conservation could be done, where it makes sense. And some of these are actually already in place. So the Sassoon Marsh has the Sassoon Marsh plan that's already in place and functioning. Yolo Bypass is well underway. It has existing planning partnerships. And you heard about earlier, they talked about, I think Chris Turnell talked about the Central Delta Corridor. This is a really exciting emerging partnership that's focused on state-owned or publicly owned and publicly financed lands and how we can do conservation on those. We've heard that's been a big emphasis from local stakeholders, is look at public lands first. So that's a very exciting one. And also the Cache Slough, there is an ongoing regional planning effort being led by the Conservancy, which I'll cover in Campbell's slides in a minute. That's another one that's emerging. And then the Delta Conservation Framework also looks ahead to other possible regional conservation strategies that could be developed, for example, in the North Delta, in the South Delta, and Contra Costa or the West Delta. And so it provides in appendices ideas for potential opportunities there, projects that are already underway, potential collaborators that would be involved in these regional planning partnerships to try and tee those up and set those off where they could happen. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Any questions of Brooke? Skip?
Mr. Chair, thank you. Brooke, excellent presentation. Maybe it's because it's a message I want to listen to. So, but what I think is notable in the first three goals, it really is about people and places. And as I indicated before, without the embracing of any effort in the Delta, it is not going to happen as quickly as some would like us to achieve our goals. But I guess it would be at this point that I have an ask of Brooke, and maybe it's Carl that I should refer this to. You're going to close the comment period on the 17th of November. And I've been asked by some of my colleagues if we could extend that, because this is going to form part of the basis for the Chapter 4 amendments. And so my ask is, can we extend the comment period?
Yes. So.
Well, that's easy, okay.
I talked with Brooke. The question is, it's how long or how much time? I think we're open to extending it out to early December, so that fits with our timeline for trying to get the framework done sometime early in 2018.
Well, Carl, thank you for that. I'm going to take that offer and get back to my colleagues. I think after the middle of the month, not much is going to happen anyway. So thank you for extending it a couple of weeks.
Sure. Again, we're trying to get as much feedback on the document, particularly from the local community and the counties, who we've been working with all along, to try to make it as appropriate a document to guide future planning efforts within the Delta to achieve the co-equal goals, as well as the objective of Delta as place within the Delta Reform Act and the Delta Plan.
All right, with that local victory, I think we'll move on to the next subject.
All right. So Campbell asked for help from the Department of Fish and Wildlife to cover his slides when he couldn't be here for a personal emergency. I just want to emphasize that these are Campbell's slides, and I'll do the best I can to represent them. And Carl and I can try and answer questions, but I also encourage you to follow up with Campbell as well. So Campbell was going to talk today about regional restoration and agricultural sustainability planning. These slides contain examples of several recent Conservancy-led efforts that are very exciting and tee directly off from the Delta Conservation Framework and the way it envisions moving conservation planning and implementation forward. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife has had a great opportunity to be a participant in both of the more specific efforts that I'm going to talk about in a minute for Campbell. So the planning context for these regional conservation planning efforts, they are intended to build on Delta Renewed, the Delta Plan, and the Delta Conservation Framework. They tee off all three of them very nicely. They are a process of collaboratively defining what we do, why we do it, and the context of how it works on the existing landscape. Emphasis on collaboration and what works on the existing landscape. So in this presentation, there are two ongoing efforts for focal planning areas in the Cache Slough Complex and the Central Delta Corridor Partnership. So you can see on this slide, this is a map, and this shows those two planning efforts that are underway. The sort of oblong oval generally outlines the area encompassed by the Central Delta Corridor Partnership, and those are the publicly owned and publicly financed lands that are currently trying to establish a regional planning partnership to look at conservation opportunities in those areas. And the circle represents the rough area encompassed by the Cache Slough Planning Partnership. So these regional planning partnerships use analyses and data tools to investigate conservation opportunities and make decisions. So that includes data management tools, including MapTerra, which is a web-based tool. They then use processes of data review and invalidation, and where they decide what data should be included and what data shouldn't be. And these analyses and tools span multiple resource areas, including agriculture, water supply and water quality, flood management, ecosystem restoration, so that's bringing in the ecology, and then other land uses and infrastructure in the area that may be important to consider. And then those are used through a process to integrate all of that data together and visualize it. And through this integration and visualization process, it helps participants identify insights on where maybe conservation makes sense in an area, and also potential gaps in information where we need to obtain more data to do effective planning. So this is a slightly complicated slide outlining the cash slough restoration planning process that was used in phase 1 of the cash slough complex planning. And I'm just going to emphasize a few points from this slide. You don't need to worry about all the text, but the top 3 colored bars, I think, are the most important ones. They highlight the 3 primary sources of data that were considered during this process. So the agricultural evaluation that was conducted through a LISA analysis by Solano County was considered. And then water management considerations, so data characterizing flood, drainage, water supply, and water quality was considered. And then also the ecosystem elements or restoration strategies were considered. So in the first part of this process, all of these were considered separately. In the second part of this process, the integration phase, these different layers were brought together and overlaid to try to think about where it makes sense to do conservation given local land use, agriculture, and existing water management considerations. And this is intended to tee up a second phase of the process, which will be a much more detailed parcel by parcel look at where we really think restoration, conservation might work in this area or where it won't. So the conclusions from the phase 1 of the cash slough process, it was a collaborative process again. There was a shared commitment among all the agencies and stakeholders to come to the table and collaborate. And I think that's really novel and exciting part of that process. As I said, DFW was able to participate throughout. The group learned from each other. So there were a diversity of participants and they brought a variety of perspectives to the table. And all the disciplines were represented from agriculture, flood management, water supply, and ecosystem restoration. The group successfully developed a shared understanding. So what data and information is valuable for the task in hand? They went through the process of parsing through the available data to figure out what was most useful and what wouldn't be useful in this process, and also what might be needed going into phase 2, the more detailed parcel level analysis. They used smaller breakout groups of subject matter experts, and those were valuable for validating the data, for deciding what data is useful and what isn't, based on their on-the-ground knowledge of the area. And that helped the data identification and validation be more accurate. And those discussions resulted in more confidence from those subject matter experts in the area about the data and the greater ownership of the process. Deadlines also help move the group forward. So the topical focus of each meeting helped participants understand each issue and other perspectives. And the visual displays through Mapterra and some of the other tools that were in a previous slide helped participants really see the integration issues and understand the issues associated with overlapping these different land use considerations. And it successfully provided insights into the data and issues that arose from the collaborative process. So that was the cash slough planning partnership, the phase 1. This is the Central Delta Corridor Partnership, and this was mentioned earlier by Chris Turnell, and I'll just restate. It's an emerging partnership. It's focused on restoring and managing publicly owned or publicly financed lands in coordination with surrounding landowners. The partners include DWR, Metropolitan Water District, TNC, Cal Waterfowl Association, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and BLM. And we are currently in the process of developing a scope of work and an outreach strategy for this to move forward with this planning and outreach process. So thank you, and I will do my best to field questions along with Carl, but I also encourage you to talk to Campbell about this exciting work that Conservancy is doing.
Yes, thank you. Great job. The San Francisco Giants should be as beneficial as a good pinch hitter as you've been. All right. So let's, with that, then let's move along to the final installment in this agenda and focus on another successful planning process. Mike?
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Randy. My name is Mike Mearswa. I'm the lead flood management planner for the California Department of Water Resources. And briefly, I wanted to let you know that I have 3 primary roles. The first is going through and doing our system-wide investment planning, both for the state of California and the Central Valley State Plan of Flood Control System. Second, I'm also the lead floodplain manager for the state of California. So when there are interactions with the Federal Emergency Management Agency, they come through me, which means where there's a nexus between land use and floodplain management, as well as a lot of the local planning that's done to actually protect citizens through measures they can implement, that passes through my purview. And then I'm also responsible for our Delta Levee System Integrity Program. Now today I'm going to focus in on the first of those 3 roles, but I believe I'll probably be talking to you at some point in time in the future for those other two roles as well. The State Plan of Flood Control is the name for the federal state project levees here in the Central Valley. There's 1,600 miles of these levees that roughly protect about $80 billion of property and about 1.3 million people who live within those floodplains. I like to remind people that there's a larger number of people who work or dependent on work within those floodplains out there too. So these represent a significant state interest. This State Plan of Flood Control was defined actually through the 2008 Central Valley Flood Protection Act, but it existed back to the 1950s when the state of California provided assurances to the federal government that we would operate and maintain these 1,600 miles of levees in perpetuity to protect California and national interests here. The system includes an extensive set of bypasses and floodways. There are two completely different river basins, the Sacramento and the San Joaquin Basin, each with over 5 major rivers. There are over 5 major urban centers plus additional adjacent urban centers, dozens of small communities, most of whom are considered disadvantaged communities, which means that they don't have the ability to protect themselves. And then also within this area, we have dozens of endangered species. The graphic you're looking out there is an aerial shot, or actually a rendering taken from National Geographic looking out over San Francisco Bay towards the Sierra Nevada. And what's interesting about this graphic is everything that you're seeing in blue is actually an irrigated water conveyance facility, and the green areas primarily represent the agricultural areas. There's some small gray spots which don't show up in this graphic, which represent really that hard landscape where people are living at. And the point I like to use with this graphic out there is to show that there really is a large distributed water management system out here. So the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, in a nutshell, is the state's strategic approach to go through and manage the flood management aspects of this landscape. And getting to comments that were out there earlier, we have to integrate with other planning activities as well that touch this same landscape out there to not only address the challenges that sit out there, but also the opportunities. The Central Valley Flood Protection Plan is updated by law every 5 years. The department is responsible for updating the plan, and then the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, which Bill Edgar sits on, is responsible for basically approving that plan. Now, as we go through the update process, the monthly meetings for the board, their coordinating committee meetings, and many other engagement venues are where we have been actually working through the practice of actually establishing and maintaining partnerships over that working landscape that I discussed before. In 2012, the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan looked at 4 real key objectives out there, and that's represented by this graphic on the left. What we ended up looking at were what would it take in time and money to go through and just repair the system from the 1950s to its original design standards. That's the blue bubble. Then we looked at what it would take in time and money to go through if we just were to protect the urban communities, which are where the highest life loss risks exist within the Central Valley. And then we also looked at what it would cost in time and money to go through and have everything that we would possibly want in 2012 in what we call the Enhanced Flood System Capacity Approach, and that's the green circle. Now, the nature of flooding in the Central Valley is that we have these major flood events that return every 10 years, and the challenge of going through and doing any of these, I would say, single-focused scenarios is that the chances are you're going to have another game changer flood that will come through and change your priorities. That's part of the reason why the plan gets updated every 5 years. We went through in 2012 and came up with a blending of these options, representing $14 to $17 billion of investments, and we labeled this approach the State System-Wide Investment Approach. That's that middle circle that you're seeing there that says blue, orange, and green. And the location of that circle shows primarily what our flood risk reduction benefits are on the bottom axis, and then we qualitatively are showing you what you're seeing for 4 other things, which are improving operations and maintenance, addressing ecosystem opportunities within our flood management system, addressing the institutional opportunities that sit out there, very similar to where we talked about having a more efficient permitting system and governance opportunities, and then finally looking at broader multi-benefit opportunities out there. Now, in 2017, you can see that we've refined our approach out there, and we now have the 2017 update for the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan costing between $17 and $21 billion. And so the cost has gone up, but you'll also see the position of the outcomes has improved for both axes out there. And one thing I wanted to describe here today is there were some policy changes at the state level between 2012 and 2017 that are relevant in our flood ecosystem planning. In particular, Governor Brown passed Executive Order B 3015, which requires us to adapt to future climate change and incorporate true life cycle cost analyses in any state investment activity so that we can incorporate that information into the 5-year infrastructure investment plan that the state puts forth to the legislature. That means that we now actually have to talk about the design life of our future investments and anticipate when we're going to need to replace those investments, as well as what the ongoing maintenance and operation costs are for those investments. And that'll get important here in a minute. Now that $17 to $21 billion included about $9 billion for system-wide investments where we have most of the ecosystem opportunities sitting out here. So now what we're looking at are two maps. This is the Ewell bypass, which we've seen before, off on the left, showing a series of projects that were identified in the 2017 Central Valley Flood Protection Plan that are multi-benefit ecosystem in nature and represent a flood risk reduction. And then on the right, an area I think that we'll be interested in talking in a little bit more detail is Paradise Cut. Chris earlier had talked about in the broader EcoRestore map out there, the L at the top and the Paradise Cut at the bottom. This is where that data, as far as landscape scale planning, is starting to come for. And the ultimate goal is for us to estimate what we think the costs are for us to go through and get into more refined, detailed planning to achieve those. One of the major concepts in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, and it's something that's carried forth into both the Ewell Bypass and Paradise Cut projects, is literally doing what the Dutch call making room for rivers and setting back the levees. Chris talked about this earlier with the levee setback project that's been proposed for the lower Elkhorn Basin, but this is a conceptual model where you can see that effectively by setting back a levee, you're actually reducing the leveraging forces that want to compromise our levee systems that result in our flood damages out here. This is also where you begin to get your ecosystem opportunities out here within this expanded reconnected floodplain. So this really is something that is in that system-wide bucket and a priority for the state. This is a more detailed graphic now on the upper Elkhorn Basin and the Ewell Bypass out here. And what I really wanted to talk about in this graphic here is this concept called Expected Annual Habitat Inundation Area. Within the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan, we identified 7 different ecosystem metrics that we're trying to achieve, and most of those are actually talking about the quality of the ecosystem habitat that you get through a restoration project. So when we dive down deeper into the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan's conservation strategy, how we designed the landscape looked at basically the response to species to the habitat type out there and the quality of that habitat so that we could actually go through and numerically quantify what the, over time, the annual expected habitat is. And in this graphic, this is the lower portion of the lower Elkhorn Basin here, which is, for those of you that aren't familiar with it, it's just across the river from the Sacramento Metropolitan Airport. So my last slide here, this is just giving you an idea within the work that we did in the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan of just one of the metrics that we talk about, and this is floodplain inundation, where we're looking at the expected annual habitat for multiple features out there. And I wanted to go back to one of the themes that we've been talking about here today, which was when we went through and came up with our preliminary work, we did this with the engagement of the local stakeholders out there. So you're seeing this regional option, RO, which is the 4th column to the left, from the left over there, where they're showing about 2,000 acres of expected annual habitat yield sitting within the, this is from the Ewell Bypass. This is that same graphic in the upper Elkhorn Basin. And then you're seeing that the preference was to actually go with the local option out here. There's also an important side note that was also addressed within this, the conservation strategy, is that we looked for different species, understanding each species has a time window at which it needs to have productivity from that land space coming out there, and also in a duration of flooding as well as a frequency of flooding. All of these parameters come from our conservation strategy and were used to help us actually on the landscape design what these features would look like. In this one, you're seeing just the spring run Chinook salmon, which, interestingly enough, their critical time period is from November through November through June is when we need to make sure we have inundation, which is fairly compatible with the typical flooding that we would have in the Ewell Bypass.
So the very serious-looking gentleman seated next to Mike is John Keane with American Rivers, who has worked with the Flood Board and with DWR as the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan was developed. John, you're going to share just a few thoughts about Paradise Cut.
Yeah, I can keep it short to Paradise Cut if that was your request.
I think, well, use your own judgment, but
I'll try to give a
short on
few preface comments before I launch into the Paradise Cut part of it. American Rivers is a national nonprofit organization that works to protect rivers for fish, wildlife, and people. And we have been very focused on working with several other conservation organizations in the Central Valley on making sure that the Central Valley Flood Protection Plan was all that it could be. And we feel very good about our partnership with DWR and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. It was a long, hard slog, and the product is really excellent. What really distinguishes the plan and makes it an award-winning plan, by the way, along with the Delta Risk Levies risk management strategy, is that it's an outcome-driven plan to achieve measurable objectives. It's a flood risk management plan rather than a flood control plan. It really embraces the notion of multi-benefit flood management projects rather than single-purpose projects. And lastly, I wanted to talk about one of the more exciting projects it suggests, which is expanding Paradise Cut. I'll just say on the outcome-driven part of the plan, it's not just about measurable outcomes for flood risk reduction, but it's also about measurable outcomes for conservation. And the amount of work that went into this was really fantastic, and I hope that it is a model for other plans going forward. By being an outcome-driven plan, it's not a list of actions or a list of projects. Rather, it's a commitment to work together to collectively invest towards a predefined set of objectives and then measure our progress against predetermined performance criteria and adapt accordingly. I think it's a model of what all our plans should be. I don't want to talk too much about this flood risk management versus flood control, but I just really think it's fundamental to our culture change and making success in an era of changing climates. We cannot control floods. We cannot eliminate all the consequences of floods. Flood risk is really acknowledging that floods are about the probability of flooding times the consequences. What we do have in our power is we can reduce is to reduce the consequences of flooding when they occur. And the flood plan is largely a portfolio of flood risk reduction strategies. One of the most very important flood risk reduction strategies is to protect floodplains, limit urbanization of dangerous floodplains, and restore floodplains, giving rivers more room to safely convey floodwaters, which is really the best way to keep communities safe from flooding. And giving rivers more room creates this opportunity to develop multi-benefit projects for restoring fish and wildlife habitat, recharging groundwater, providing recreational opportunities, et cetera. And this concept of multi-benefit projects has really taken off in the context of the flood plan. It's generated a lot of excitement. Everybody knows what we're talking about. Everyone wants a multi-benefit project. And it's not just an idea. They're actually happening up and down the valley thanks to the funding by DFW, WCB, federal agencies, and the Delta Conservancy. And I could talk more about what some of those are, but I'll just go to my favorite, which is the Paradise Cut project. This is a locally supported project. There is no opposition to this project that would expand the Paradise Cut floodway by about 2,000 acres. It would add 2,000 acres of farmland into the floodway. It's kind of like creating a new YOLO bypass, but in the southern delta that would redirect dangerous floodwaters away from the Stockton metropolitan area along the corridor of Lathrop, Manteca, and Stockton, and instead into the undeveloped delta where there's more capacity to retain these floodwaters. It would actually lower flood stage along 30 miles of the San Joaquin River between the confluence of the Stanislaus and Stockton Deepwater Ship Channel. One of the things that was key to gaining public support was the technical analysis that demonstrated that it would be possible to maintain the land that's added to the bypass into in agriculture. And the reason it's possible to do this is because unlike the YOLO bypass, which of course supports agriculture, in this case, this flood bypass would only take floodwaters once every 10 years during very extreme events. So the rest of the time, the farmers who farm there would own their land and continue to farm it much the way they do today, which is for alfalfa and other seasonal field crops. We're now, American Rivers has been working with DWR and other agencies to move this project along. We're trying to be a private partner that can help expedite the project. And we're very far along in attempting to negotiate and purchase flood easements for Paradise Cut. We've got $2 million grants from CDFW and the Delta Conservancy for a total of $4 million. It's my understanding that there's funds in the FY18 budget that can be used for these flood easement acquisitions. And our negotiations with the landowners are going very well. We now have appraisals and very far along in the negotiating purchase agreements on 70% of the acres in the 2,000 acre zone. One reason that I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you today is to tell you about one big hurdle we have in our way. One big challenge. And from what I understand, this is the kind of challenge that's going to come up elsewhere. Turns out that about half of the land that we need to acquire flood easements on is already held under an agricultural conservation easement by the Central Valley Farmland Trust. And this easement does not legally allow subsequent easements, like a flood easement, that would, quote, significantly impair the agricultural capacity of the property. So we are currently working very closely with the Central Valley Farmland Trust, which holds this easement, to figure out what to do. They have been great to work with. Their suggestion was to put together an objective, independent panel of experts to help us figure out how to navigate this. We have done that. We have Joe Countryman from the Flood Board is on this panel. Steve Oliva, the former counsel for the Department of Conservation, is on the panel. The San Joaquin County Ag Commissioner is on the panel, or Ag Extension Agents on the panel, and we're working through these issues. It's likely that we may need some sort of extraordinary measure, like new legislation, to actually make this work. We're hoping that we can get some clever idea that would avoid the kind of contortions we'd have to do that. But I may need your help, and that was one of the main reasons I'm grateful to come here today and tell you it's going really great, but I may need your help. In particular, one of the first stops we're going to make after this panel makes its factual determinations is the director of the Department of Conservation, to determine how much flexibility they have in how this easement is managed into the future. Thank you.
Thank you. There was a little bit of I noticed a little bit of a relief when you said you need a panel of experts, and then you began to mention other people besides who's around this table. I think there was good, not another job. Unless there are any specific questions from the panelists that you just heard, I'm going to recommend we take a 10-minute break. When we come back, I want to wrap up what you've heard into what kind of outcomes would you like to see in the Delta in the year 2050, and what steps are each of your agencies intending to take to get there? So when we come back, those are the questions we're going to tackle. Panelists, thank you very much for your time. Great reports.
since I got sequestered in this.
Well, not that I know of right now, but what I hear is that there's an effort to grant up very soon. This is actually funding that's going to be available for projects. So if you're expressing.
Okay, so apparently the break wasn't quite long enough for some of us, but we will be back to full strength here very shortly. Again, we've dedicated this part of the agenda for a conversation among committee members about desired outcomes in the Delta related to the ecosystem and habitat under the year 2050. We've already picked up on some of the comments that you've made, and so to start this conversation, I've asked Jessica Law to review those outcomes that you have already identified as desirable.
Thank you, Randy. So I picked up a few things from our discussion earlier, and please let me know if I've missed anything. But the short list so far is from Felicia Marcus to be sure to send the committee members drafts of the ecosystem amendment and to really rely on your agencies for input and feedback on that process as we move forward. I know our staff is very grateful to hear that, so thank you for that encouragement. To work for EPA and sustainable conservation to work together moving forward to further streamline and align permitting processes. And I saw you talking at the break, so that's also encouraging. Thank you. I heard some feedback on considering nationwide permits for restoration work in the Delta, and that might also be an opportunity to look into. And of course, to extend the conservation framework comment period. So I think we checked that one off the list. But that's the overall feedback that I've heard so far. Did I miss anything?
I do. So as you look ahead 35 years from now, knowing the work that you're all involved in today, what is it that you hope is accomplished by the year 2050 as it relates to the Delta ecosystem? I told staff there is the possibility that all we would hear is crickets at this point. And I think, Karen, in terms of agriculture, I think one of the goals that I have, one of the outcomes I would like to see is this integration of farming practices that are wildlife friendly. And we've seen some of that in the Sacramento Valley as it relates to the Pacific Flyway. Paul mentioned that earlier.
So in 35 years, I would hope that we don't even have to use the terminology wildlife friendly. It's just part of how we farm and steward our ecosystem. I would also hope that in 35 years, everything that is threatened and endangered now is actually off the list, and that we are very proactive in when we see where the threats are, because our climate will continue to change, that, biology happens, that we are constantly in a position of being able to rapidly respond to species at risk, and that it's just a natural way of how we manage the ecosystem, that we're constantly taking things off the list and avoiding having to put more onto the list, and that it's not the boy, in 35 years, I asked me for a dream, I'm going to dream big. And in 35 years, it's not confrontational, because we're not saying it's fish or farming, the economy or the environment. It's just very integrated in a systems approach to how we live and coexist.
That's great.
And that's my dream.
That's great. Anyone else?
Yeah, just to build on that, I think we have a recipe and the other, the rice land farming community, the partnership that is there. As I was hearing kind of an update on the projects that we have today, the land acquisition and the success of partnerships, the immediate thing that came to mind, right, to me was, what is the next project that we should focus on collectively and to be able to bring the level of partnership and offer the incentives that are going to be necessary for that to continue. I think I was really impressed with the accomplishment of, what Bill and what everybody provided here in the form of an update. And to me, I mean, the challenge that I personally will take here is what is the next project that as agencies around the table, we can all bring as an underlying objective and goal and contribute the same level of partnership that is going to take us to, I'm looking at the list, to cross another project off the list. So to me, that is kind of an underlying objective, so that 35 years from now is a list of items that we have accomplished together. From Reclamation's perspective, I mean, we bring a lot of the investment and a lot of the funding that is enabling both the monitoring, the science, because those are going to continue to help us bring the fish to a recovery stage that hopefully harmonizes then the partnership that we all look for and strive for having. And so to me, that's kind of what I see from my agency's perspective.
And that's a really important point, is that you have to start one project at a time. And so getting together to identify where the incentives could come from, and that's where I know that our state conservationist is still in Puerto Rico because he was supposed to go to Chile with me in 2 weeks. But NRCS is going to be a valuable partner in that, making sure that if we need to, through the Farm Bill process, make sure that there's something there to expand where the incentives can and should be. One of the things we're advocating is that on-farm groundwater recharge would be something that should be expanded on the NRCS list. And if we need to do it differently than what they've been able to be very responsive with incentive dollars in the Sacramento Valley for the wildlife, is making sure that we're thinking now about what that is. Because what one project at a time does is build the trust so it becomes very routine. This is how we collaborate, and we get some successes, and then it builds for the next one.
Barry and then Paul.
Thanks. One of the things that interests me, and it was heartened by Chris's presentation, is the interconnectedness piece, and that we're actually starting to see some signs of moving in that direction to tie some of these habitats together. And I think we're interested in it both from the Delta perspective and how do we interconnect all those habitats, but then how do we actually connect the entire ecosystem? So when we're doing reintroduction efforts above Shasta or other parts of the watershed, how do we tie that together through the Delta out to the ocean? And then there's also a large monitoring science component, and and our science center is working on ocean ecology and ocean ecosystems, and how do we tie that back so we actually have the full life cycle. And it's, from a science perspective, we want to maintain the full life cycle. But then from the management perspective, I think there's some value to actually tying those fish to the people across that landscape so that everybody has an incentive to actually maintain and support those fish as they go through their life cycle, so that we're all bought into that same recovery perspective throughout the ecosystem.
Paul?
Lots of great comments here. I'll try to add a couple of different ones and maybe a nuance or two for one that's been said already. A conversation about storage and infrastructure. We've talked about sites, reservoir, we've talked about storage on some level, and that's got a role to play in a future for the Delta. Groundwater is a key part of storage as well. Again, going back to my time recently at Kern Water Bank, we're going to have opportunities in the future to try and create more water banks with agricultural lands that perhaps aren't going to be farmed at some future time. There's a confluence of lots of different factors that are going to give us opportunities that I think we should really try to take advantage of. Transparency in government and engagement with the public, local communities, that's been a key theme here today. We've been thinking a lot about that in our organization now on the heels of the WIN Act, the Water Infrastructure Improvements for the Nation Act. I always struggle with what those words are. How can we even be better in terms of public engagement with our water operational recommendations to create that balance where we're doing our best to strike that grand compromise between the needs of wildlife and fish and farmers and communities, which are all legitimate. I would love a time in the future where we're all respectful of each of those three factors and doing our best to strike that balance every day. The third point I'll make is science investments for flexibility. There's a growing interest around hatcheries for some of our very imperiled fisheries, creating some flexibility that will allow us to have a safety net, if you will, for species on the brink of extinction that allows us to buy time to get to recovery. There are others, the YOLO bypass, fish food testing that's been going on, trying to bring cultured fish into the mix and figure out how we help them through these restoration projects is another area. All of this learning can help us get more flexibility in the future to achieve all the goals we seek.
Yes, Kristen.
So there's been a lot of discussion today about focus on the local communities that are currently in and around the Delta. And I wonder, and you spoke too about environmental justice concerns, that you're seeking input to update that part of the chapter. Is CalEnviroscreen on your radar at all? So CalEnviroscreen is a mapping tool that Cal EPA and the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, so OEHA, put together. OEHA manages it, but it is a mapping tool that is by census tract and identifies pollution burdens of communities in and around, well, it's throughout the state, but if you just take a look at the communities that line the Delta and that are within the Delta, there are several that are red in color, which indicates that they're suffering from high pollution burdens of various types. And when you drill down into the map, you can identify some of the indicators. So there's water quality, there's air quality, there's asthma rates. I mean, it sort of runs the gamut. OEHA does a really nice job, too, of sort of helping facilitate identification of what the particular communities are experiencing. So I'd be happy to help sort of get you all speaking together with OEHA. They can also come and do presentations to the council if that would be something you'd be interested in. So,
That's very good. Appreciate that.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Chris.
I'll just put forward that I would certainly be willing to come back in 6 months if that was appropriate, and to answer, I think, one of Frederico's questions, which is, so what's the next project that we can all focus on? I would say that, you know, what's emerging, if you can kind of think back or look back at some of the slides that I talked about, those purple areas, I think that the lower YOLO bypass would be an area that would warrant, and some of the opportunities that are emerging there that include both flood risk management, tidal habitat restoration, floodplain restoration, agricultural sustainability, some of the really complex issues that all of our agencies deal with. I think it could be, if there was interest from the committee in having a focused conversation on some of the opportunities and challenges that are emerging there, because it is indicative of, I think, the next wave of progress, which is things ain't getting any easier. But that region kind of exemplifies some of the planning challenges, implementation challenges, and these multiple benefit interlocking pieces that, again, if there was interest in focusing on that region, there's a lot of overlap and interest there. So,
Chris, a question, because those are very complex. And as part of it, getting the people, we've talked a lot today about additional outreach, the importance of local engagement. Is part of that just the public outreach and bringing all the parties together? Is that one of the challenges that would be a part of what you're talking about there? Besides just biology and other things.
yeah, no, absolutely. I think getting a more clear sense, for example, from the agricultural community about what are some of their concerns when it comes to restoring habitats that were once habitat but are currently now in agricultural production or in duck club use or something like that. So you start getting really quickly into conversations of potential for safe harbor agreements or other sorts of protections that can give the agricultural community peace of mind while also being able to pursue large-scale, landscape-scale habitat restoration that's necessary. So it's the interplay between those that, again, is exemplified in that region, and I think we could probably make some good progress there.
Put it on your to-do list.
Roger that.
And the next DPIIC meeting is in the binder, so you'll know when your due date is.
I'm sure it's April.
Okay, good, thanks. Carl and then Bill.
So just to kind of work off of Chris' So this comment, I think, and in response to Federico's comment about what the next project is, we have 2 documents out there, the Delta Smelt Resiliency Strategy and the Salmon Resiliency Strategy. Those outline a whole suite of actions. There's also the CVPIA. And I think, as opposed to maybe looking for new projects, let's focus on what we can do to make sure those plans and efforts are implemented and supported going into the future. Because those have a long time horizon on them. They're not just 1 or 2 things. They're, what do we do about Battle Creek and getting it performing right away, as opposed to, at some point in the future, and it's been going on for a long time. And we need to make some choices about funding and how much we carry out and what. And I think there are also elements for things like the forthcoming feasibility study for Frank's Track. These are significant alterations of the system. Just restoring stuff, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily change the way the system functions. And one of the things that comes out of the Delta Renewed is that we need to do some things to tweak the fundamental nature of the Delta as it currently exists to make it function a little more like it used to. And I think there are opportunities to do that, and by the next meeting we'll have the feasibility study done, and it'll be available, and we can talk about that as an example. But it also goes to kind of the larger integration of the Yola Bypass Fish Enhancement Program with the broader flood protection objectives, and how those get meshed going forward, and how we work together to make those happen, because there's a lot of local interest in making those things happen. And how do we foster that? And those, when you roll them all up, are significant, significant infrastructure improvements with significant costs associated with them. Another component is potentially relocating the North Bay Aqueduct intake to really make Cash Slough work better. So, there's a number of things that I think should be talked about as we go forward, and how do we, make decisions about even pursuing those kinds of approaches.
Bill Edgar?
Randy, I'm focused on a process problem, or a series of processes. As Mike Mirzwa pointed out, and as John Kane pointed out on the flood plan, the flood plan was approved on August 25th of this year, and has successfully navigated its way through the environmental processes and tribal consultations and so on, and it's ready to be implemented, past the 30-day requirement and so on. And a lot of people are wanting to start implementing it right away. So my concern is to make sure that these plans, whether it's the Delta plan or the flood plan or the Sigma or whatever we're doing related to the Central Valley and the Delta, fit together as pieces of a puzzle under the governor's water action plan, and are moving seamlessly ahead with no disconnects. That's what I would hope. Then it would be my hope that we could, in my case, approach the Corps of Engineers and say, we want the same kind of status that we have for the Everglades, that we have for Chesapeake Bay, that we have for the Great Lakes, that we have for the frontal area along the Louisiana coast. This is the way we're going to restore the ecosystems in the Central Valley. This is the way we're going to gain better flood protection for the residents of California. It's pursuant to the governor's action plan and these various plans that are seamlessly parts of the collage that support that vision. And this business of individual authorizations, the bank authorization, the this authorization, that authorization, where each project has to be a tub that sits on its own bottom in terms of economics, is no longer the way we're going to do revitalization or redevelopment of this system. Whether it's the ecosystem, whether it's the flood system, whether it's water supply, whether it's water quality, this is the plan that everybody's doing, and we want you to recognize that. And that would do lots of, or relieve us anyway, I don't know about the rest of the agencies, but sure relieve us of a lot of headaches, disconnects between these authorizations and so on. Then I think one of the biggest issues we have, at least going through the flood planning phase, is what Skip talked about, and that is we have to have local support for any of these plans to move forward. Simply aren't going to do it if we do. We learned that. And I think, for example, on the operation and maintenance of levees, that's supposed to be a responsibility, forget the money for a minute, responsibility of local government. They do it best, they do it more efficiently, they do it more cost effective, and we've learned that in just the recent past with the repairs that we've had to do because of the storms. So what we do is step number 2 is to make sure that what Dan Dooley said at Secretary Ross's forum on Sigma, that we got to view these efforts as local empowerment initiatives where the local governments are really involved, new ideas bubble up. They're all different. You know, the San Joaquin's going to be different than the Delta, and the Delta is going to be different than the Yolo Bypass, and so on, and Feather River is different than all of them. But we've got to identify these planning areas. We've got to set the boundaries, and then we have in mind of reactivating the Sacramento San Joaquin Drainage District assessment for ongoing sustainable funding for operation and maintenance of these levees, which are substandard now. But we're going to have to work with local government to do that. We're going to have to give them the authority to do that, which they're supposed to have now anyway. And we keep stumbling over each other. And I think one of the things that the state needs to do is decide who does things best. And I think things like operation and maintenance are best done at the local level. I think that planning and enforcement of the plan and compliance with permitting and so on is probably best done at the state. And just figure out who's going to do what. That's our biggest issue. And once we get that done, then the thing begins to roll and we can get on to different projects. But I think there's some really fundamental process issues that we've got to deal with here. And to be honest, I'm a little concerned about the flood plan being the only one that's ready to implement right now. It's out there in the lead. We're implementing projects. We're trying to be transparent to make sure that we aren't stepping on others' toes, but it's an issue that we've got to pay attention to.
Bill, you offer some excellent thoughts, and I guess I feel obligated to point out that the reason the legislature asked the Delta Stewardship Council to create a Delta plan was to have that long-term management plan for the Delta that all other plans in the Delta would be found consistent with. That's how it's under the umbrella of the Delta plan that we find the consistency. What we're asking for today, specifically on the ecosystem chapter, is help us add more rigor to that plan. that values the work that each and every one of these agencies around the table is doing, has done, is ready to do, so that from a legacy perspective, whomever is the next administration, either state or federal, they can rest assured that in that plan is an agreement by the key fish, water, EPA agencies, and so on, to move forward so that we don't lose momentum from one administration to the next. So I would offer up that in May of 2013, we developed a long-term management plan for the Delta, and it needs our input. And the kinds of comments that you made today and others have made are going to be incorporated into this next round of amendments. So I thank you for that. Anything else on this matter? John?
I'll add, I think from a science perspective, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think the opportunity to look at ecosystem function is really important. And I think down the road we need to, in addition to looking at acres, look more at how ecosystems, what benefits ecosystems are providing. An important link to thinking about community benefits is embracing ecosystem services, which is the idea of what do ecosystems provide that provide benefits for humans, and is really something that we talk about, but we haven't done a lot to really evaluate and place value on ecosystems. I think if we did that, we could do a better job of convincing communities that a floodplain protection actually provides all kinds of enormous economic benefits as well as ecosystem benefits. And then the last thing I think in terms of science is more integration of science and experimentation specifically into restoration projects, so that each time we do a project, not only do we restore 1,000 acres, but we move science forward and understand better how to restore the next project, so that we really make significant steps on each project and learn from all of them.
Mr. Chair.
Skip.
Okay, very quickly, you know, I've heard some encouraging words around the table, partnership, collaboration. You know, from the local government's perspective, this guy speaking for himself, is that there's this lack of trust between the local government and the state government. And why? Because it's always been top down. Here's what you're going to do, and if you don't, there are consequences, usually lack of resources. And to Bill's comments, you know, local government can probably do that maintenance operation on levees much better than the state, but we don't have the ability to generate the revenue that's required. So obviously we have to have that partnership between the state and the local government to do the levee maintenance. I think Bill's right on. We can do it better and probably less costly. But I think we need to get away from this finger pointing at local government or state government to say, well, it's your problem or your fault. And I guess the last comment is, I don't know about you all, but I'm getting whiplash between the different administrations, and we embark down this one path, and all of a sudden we have a change. And I hope that you all are sitting around this table are able to convince the new administrations that, look, this is a plan. It can't change every 4 years because we have a different administration. We have to have consistency. Here's the game plan. We need to stick with it. Thank you.
Okay. Felicia?
I'm sorry I came in a little late, so I don't want to repeat what anybody said. It sounded like people handled, if we're looking 35 years ahead, that we have a more ecological approach to what we're doing from the headwaters to the ocean, et cetera, and that we don't have to keep bringing up why that's a good idea. This is sort of like Back to the Future, that we're rediscovering the 70s or something, maybe the 60s, but and that we're going from a basis of shared science, shared information, and all of that, so that the ecology of the ecosystem, including the people in the ecosystem, is more recognized and worked, and we've restored all kinds of things. So proof of concept, we're not having to labor over why we should work together. We are just working together. But I would emphasize that, and today we've already highlighted a lot of the pieces of issues that are actually of profound importance compared to all the conversations that we've had before, and highlight the value of the Delta Council as a forum and all the work that goes into it, but that the human ecosystem of how we work with each other and communicate, it shouldn't be underestimated. It doesn't just happen. So if we can actually not only match words and perfect plans that each of our agencies can do separately and start integrating each other's work, coupled with the phenomenal work of getting things done on the ground that people can see as tangible optimism, I think that also helps us figure out how to bring people along. But if we can get to hold both of those as our vision, and that it's as important for us to figure out how to work together as it is to just do stuff on the ground, we're more likely to accomplish the work on the ground.
Karen?
So I love that everybody wants to talk about ecosystem services, because we started there with the environmental farming science panel with definitions and identifying the wheel of services and case studies around it. But at 2 weeks ago, the California Forward Annual Economic Summit featured natural working landscapes. There's a whole new attention being paid on rural communities. But there's a new paper that was presented by the University of California on ecosystem services and California's working landscapes. So it's just one more piece of literature that we would all want to make sure that we incorporate that work into what you're doing there.
This is great. And our staff, and perhaps I, will be reaching out to those of you that have offered up suggestions to get more help. Bill, in particular, with the Army Corps, they were stretched so thin that they were unable to deploy someone to join us today, but they are a member of this committee, and I would welcome your input and any other agency's input to help schedule a meeting with them on this matter between now and when we meet again in April. In the interest of time, and if no one else has anything more to add to this great conversation, I would like to now move to agenda item 3 and introduce our lead scientist at the Delta Stewardship Council, Dr. John Callaway. Dr. John Callaway comes to us from the University of San Francisco and is a wetlands specialist with extensive experience in the Gulf Coast and in the San Francisco Bay. John is going to walk you through some updates on some progress on science matters that have historically linked every one of our agencies together at these meetings. So John, welcome.
Great, thank you. And as Randy said, I'm going to give you a quick update on 2 issues that we've already talked about a little bit, and then we'll hear from Lindsay Correa and from Yumi Henneberry to hear about the Science Action Agenda and the update to the science plan. So the first thing I'm going to talk about, and actually, if someone, Jessica, can you update the slides or advance slides? Okay, so the next slide. The first thing to talk about is integrated modeling. And let's see. Yeah, this slide right there. So integrated modeling, you all already have talked about a fair amount and really endorsed. The modeling workshop in 2015 really looked at the use of integrated modeling here in the Delta. The Science Enterprise Workshop that Mike and Jessica put together last year in 2016. Also, really, one of the key points that came out of that meeting was an emphasis on the use of integrated modeling. And as Randy mentioned, I've been involved with work in Louisiana, and I've been working on modeling of wetland ecosystems, effects of climate change on wetland ecosystems, and how to use models to evaluate that. I worked with the group in Louisiana that presented at the Science Enterprise Workshop. I was one of the advisors to an outside group of advisors to develop modeling and to identify how modeling could be used most effectively in Louisiana. And really the way it was used there was to prioritize restoration spending. So as I think probably you all are aware, Louisiana's coast is already disappearing at a pretty rapid rate, and with sea level rise is going to disappear at an unbelievably rapid rate over the next 30 to 50 years. So the state is embarking on an enormous effort, multi-billion-dollar effort to do restoration. And so they spent about $10 million developing a model there that looked at hydrologic water flow in the Mississippi and the other drainages, delivery of sediment to the coast, the buildup of wetlands, the impacts of nutrients on those wetlands. And so they really did an idea of an integrated model, many different components to try to project how the coast would develop over time. What they also did was then take those projections of habitat and say, how many fish is that going to support? How many alligators is that going to support? How is the local community going to benefit from that? Is it going to really have an impact on storm surge on the coast? And so it's really a great example where they put together all these different pieces. It was a significant effort over many years, but I think it's an inspiration for what could be done here in the Delta. And so this slide that's up really just highlights at the previous meeting for DPIIC what was really the focus and what was the status there. So since then, we have been making a significant effort over the last 6 months to make more progress towards integrative modeling. So the science program has put together an integrated model steering committee with about 20 members from many of your agencies, as well as from academia and consulting firms that have developed many of the local models. It includes model developers, but not just modelers, also model users and managers. And the idea of it, as is indicated there for committee goals, is to identify how models can be used specifically to address management decisions. And so what the team is trying to do is identify specific questions, not something that will take us 10 years to develop, but a focused management question that we could, in the next 2 years, use existing models, figure out how to put together some of the existing models for hydrology or species models, and use those existing models to address an important ecosystem or important management question. As I said, really it's focused on management issues, it's focused on using existing models, and with a time frame of 2 to 3 years as a first step towards developing a much broader use of models across the whole Delta. So this hopefully would be a demonstration to show that we really can use models very effectively. So in terms of the next steps that are there, we are now just beginning. We've had 2 meetings. We had our second meeting just about a week ago. We're meeting every 2 months. And we now will be developing a charge for the group, identifying roles and responsibilities, trying to identify this a management issue that we feel is appropriate. We'll be coming back to you as we develop the ideas of appropriate management question to get your feedback and agreement that it really is an appropriate management question to be addressing, and then make progress towards developing that model. And next slide. One of the big parts of this, I think, is that just making people aware. There actually are a lot. One thing we talked about at our most recent meeting was that there actually are a number of integrative models already out that are being used, but they're being used sort of on a one-off effort, and then people come back and reinvent the wheel the next time they do it. So one thing we'd like to do is to develop sort of a digital library of the models that are out there so that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel each time. Part of that is outreach and letting everyone know about what kinds of models are being developed. So we have the science program, as you all are aware, I'm sure, supports a number of brown bags, and we have a series of brown bag events coming up on modeling. The first one was just last week on ELAM, a model of fish behavior and how hydrology affects fish behavior and how that might be used for management. So we'll have a series of those coming up over the winter and early spring. And the middle flyer there that's on the screen of Jim Peterson's presentation really links to the connection between modeling and the second topic I want to talk about, which is structured decision making. So I think, hopefully with the modeling effort, we will continue to make that progress, and we'll come back to you with a management question, and in a couple years we'll come back to you with a model that managers can use that could address some of these questions. So that's what I want to talk about with modeling. This other issue that's really linked to this is structured decision making that you've also talked about and you endorsed previously. And the science program has been, again, supporting an effort to do a pilot project using structured decision-making within the Delta. And this is work closely linked to efforts with the Bureau of Reclamation. So the idea of structured decision-making, what is structured decision-making that is presented there? It says it's a carefully organized process to evaluate critical issues and reach efficient and transparent decisions for stakeholder-developed objectives. I think what's most important there, it's organized, it's structured, and it's transparent. Jim Peterson, who gave that brown bag that I mentioned previously, he described structured decision-making as the scientific method applied to resource decision-making issues. And rather than looking at hypotheses and experiments, we're looking at identifying management objectives and how we can evaluate and reach those objectives. So at this brown bag, in addition to the brown bag, we had a one-day workshop with the Bureau of Reclamation and many others. 33 participants from 14 different agencies within the Delta participated. We were able to come up with, at the first meeting in one day, come up with an overall goal or mission statement for the group. And I won't read you the mission statement, it's there. But the idea is to evaluate how to spend or where to put resources within the Delta using this idea of structured decision making. And so we had our first meeting in August. The second meeting will come up this Wednesday, just in 2 days, and we'll have the same group get together. The idea there is that we will then go from a mission statement to developing specific objectives of what we want to try to achieve with the structured decision making. Once we have objectives in place, then we will identify the framework for how we make those decisions, the criteria, and this is linked to modeling because the way that we evaluate those decisions is using a model of outcomes, linking a series of different alternative approaches to management and using models to evaluate which of those alternatives is likely to be most effective. So that's my summary of structured decision making, and now I'm going to turn it over to Lindsay Correa and Yumi Henneberry, and they're going to give us an overview of the Science Action Agenda.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Callaway, and good afternoon, DPIIC members. Thank you for the opportunity to present to you the completed 2017-2021 Science Action Agenda, which Yumiko and I will slip into referring to as the SAA throughout this presentation. Let's see. The objective of today's discussion is to provide the committee with an overview of the SAA and give you the context to take action on the Delta Science Program's request, which is in line with some of the discussion earlier from Director Souza about science investments, initiating learning, and Chair Marcus's comments about shared science. Our request is that the committee continue to lend its science managers to the Delta Agency Science Work Group to work with the Delta Science Program to jointly implement the Science Action Agenda. I will first provide you with an overview of the highlights from a year of community contributions to this effort that have really provided an open and inclusive process for the development of the SAA, and then touch on how this effort continues a larger effort to achieve the vision of One Delta, One Science that's formalized in the Delta Science Plan as your sort of vision statement for this year. Yumiko will then provide you with an overview of the major themes in the SAA that were shaped by community comments in the Delta Independent Science Board's review, and conclude with a discussion of next steps. So because the Science Action Agenda is intended to be owned and implemented by the broad Delta science community, we sought input early and throughout the development process. The SAA would not have come to fruition without your November 2016 dedication of the Delta Agency Science Work Group to work with us to develop the product before you today. During the first 6 months of this effort, we reached out to this collaborative group and others, as well as the diverse Delta Science community at a town hall meeting at the Bay Delta Science Conference. We asked for input on 3 things. 1, how we could make the SAA most useful to the community. 2, input on science actions to later be prioritized in the Science Action Agenda. And 3, input on the criteria that we would then use to prioritize a short list. As a result, we learned that the SAA would be most valuable to the community if it focused on gaps in glue. And this is something that Peter Goodwin, a former lead scientist, used to talk about. And these are activities that are priorities among multiple groups, but have not yet been implemented. These are actions that present opportunities to speed progress on efforts that cross agency mandates. So this action agenda really does focus on gaps in glue science activities. It's not an inventory of every important science activity in the Delta. We received a lot of input on documents, reports, materials to look at, work plans to consider as inputs, and as a result reviewed over 40 documents and about 550 actions prior to prioritization. The science program took the lead on applying criteria vetted by other collaborative groups and developed a short list of science actions organized in 5 themes that were later vetted by leading scientists from agency and stakeholder groups, as well as a science advisory committee at the beginning of this calendar year. We used the feedback we received to re-engage the Delta Agency Science Work Group to get input on how to prioritize gaps in glue science actions within the action areas that we had worked to develop. The result of this input served as the foundation for a draft SAA that was distributed through the Council's listserv in April of 2017 and the basis for open public comment and at both the Delta Independent Science Board meetings and the Council meetings. This was also the draft that initiated the Delta ISB's review of the SAA. And in August of this year, the Delta Stewardship Council received and accepted the Science Action Agenda. While I've highlighted 1 year of community contributions to this SAA, I'd like to remind the DPIIC that this collaborative journey to develop this SAA really started with the Delta Science Plan, which was presented to you at your first DPIIC meeting in April of 2014. It's one element of a 3-part Delta Science strategy to achieve the vision of One Delta, One Science, and the SAA complements and balances the strategic vision set by the Delta Science Plan and lays out science actions to address knowledge gaps identified in the 2016 State of Bay Delta Science. This SAA also builds on collaborative science efforts initiated as part of the development of the interim science action agenda in 2014, which was brought to this committee, and also the associated DPIIC high impact science actions that were developed in 2015. Those initial efforts served as the first attempts to inventory science priorities across the policy issues in the Delta and try to find common areas on which to move forward. This SAA, however, is our first attempt to complete an action agenda that prioritizes and aligns priorities across the system to meet both pragmatic and aspirational goals. Now Yumiko will go over the major elements of the SAA and how it was shaped by this ongoing community input.
Thank you, Lindsay. Hello. So the Science Action Agenda consists of 13 science actions the Delta community recognized as high priority. So I want to emphasize what Lindsay said earlier, that what sets these science actions apart from those identified in other strategic efforts is that these actions are not only widely recognized as high priority, of high importance and prioritized, but they're also meant to serve as the gaps in glue. So they address key gaps acknowledged by multiple groups, and they are intended to promote collaborative efforts to address those gaps. These science actions, in turn, are ranked within 5 thematic action areas, which emerged during the document development, as Lindsay described. The Science Action Agenda also identifies 12 additional science actions. And these are science actions the Delta community recognized as important and should be taken on as the higher priority science actions are addressed and funds become available. So the 5 thematic areas range from investing in incorporating the human dimensions in the natural sciences, increasing science synthesis, developing tools to evaluate habitat restoration, improving our understanding of the relationships between species and stressors, and modernizing monitoring, data management, and modeling. Several of the topics discussed earlier today fall under many of these action areas. So some initial steps have been taken already to implement the Science Action Agenda. For example, the Sea Grant Delta Science Fellowship, which the Delta Stewardship Council sponsors. Also, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Delta Water Quality and Ecosystem Restoration Grant Program, funded through Proposition 1. The Delta Science Fellows called for applications to include topics highlighted in the Science Action Agenda, while the most recent CDFW Proposition 1 solicitation packet calls for studies that support Science Action Agenda implementation. However, to fully progress the Science Action Agenda implementation, collective action is needed. The Delta Agency Science Work Group has been involved early on in the development of the Science Action Agenda, beginning with the high-impact science actions, as Lindsay mentioned. And we would like to really request the DPIIC for the DASW's continued participation in working with the Delta Science Program to jointly implement the 2017-2021 Science Action Agenda so that we can advance scientific discoveries, sustain essential science programs, and modernize the Delta Science enterprise. With that request, we're happy to answer any questions, and we're looking forward to your response.
Thank you both for all the great work, a good presentation. Let me rephrase the question. Is there any agency seated at the table that wishes to withdraw their staff person to help in this endeavor? Looks like you've got a group that you can continue to count on.
Any other questions?
Yeah, it's one Delta, one science coming to life, and it's pretty thrilling to think where we've come from in the last 3 or 4 years. It really is a partnership developing among agencies around science. So, 3B.
Okay, 3B, we have our same presenters. Yumi and Lindsay are going to give us an overview of the current update that will be taking place to the science plan.
Great, thank you. Hello again. So we'd like to switch gears to a related but different effort, which is the update of the Delta Science Plan, which will be beginning early next year. So for this session, I would like to provide a really brief overview of what the updates of the 2018 Delta Science Plan review and update will involve. I'm going to also have a similar request to DPIIC, which is for the DPIIC to grant additional engagement from the Delta Agency Science Work Group to update and develop strategies for continued and joint implementation of the Delta Science Plan. So the Delta Science Plan was released in 2013, and as Lindsay mentioned earlier, presented to you at the very first DPIIC meeting in April 2014. Many members here in agencies were directly involved in the Delta Science Plan development, and we'd like to thank you for your continued engagement. There was a mini update in 2016 where we added 2 appendices to guide collaborative funding of science to address an action that was identified in the DPIIC's High Impact Science Actions, which was also endorsed by you in 2015. For those members who are new, and also just to provide a brief reminder, the Delta Science Plan is a document that was called for in the Delta Plan and is a framework for organizing, conducting, and integrating science in the Delta. So why review and update the Delta Science Plan? We are initiating this update for several reasons. In the Delta Science Plan itself, it calls for updates every 5 years to allow new concepts to be incorporated so the science plan is relevant to the current science and management landscape in the Delta. The update also allows us to reflect on what has been accomplished and how science has advanced in the Delta since the release of the Delta Science Plan in 2013. Much work has been done, as been discussed during this session, since 2013, and your agencies have contributed to many efforts that have helped implement the Delta Science Plan. Some of these accomplished include a workshop to report on integrated modeling and adaptive management, ongoing efforts, as John described, ongoing use of independent scientific review for various scientific efforts in the Delta. And the science program has also led the effort in the State of Bay Delta Science and the Science Action Agenda release, the two other elements of the Delta Science Plan, science strategy. DPIIC agencies made substantial contributions to both these elements. Concurrent with the science plan update, the Delta Plan will also be undergoing its 5-year review, and the science program will be coordinating with the Delta Stewardship Council's planning and executive decisions. We're informing and engaging you on this update because the Delta Science Plan will require participation from the Delta Science community as a whole to ensure the vision of one Delta, one science is met. And by one Delta, one science, we mean a Delta Science community that works collaboratively and openly to produce knowledge that is shared and accepted widely as credible, relevant, and legitimate. The Delta Science Plan was developed with input from the wider Delta Science community, including DPIIC members. The goal for this update is to have the same level of engagement to ensure the science plan is accepted as an important science framework that reflects a broad set of needs in the Delta and to promote joint implementation. So this timeline is meant to provide you with an overview of some of the highlights included in the Delta Science Plan update. As our request includes DASW engagement, the stars on the slide indicate where input from the DASW would be valuable. So the first 6 months will involve science plan review of the science plan and early input from the public, including a public workshop to receive feedback and suggestions for additional actions or themes that would benefit the science plan. The second half of the year will involve review of a draft updated Delta Science Plan by both the public and the Delta Independent Science Board and finalization of the plan. DASW engagement would be particularly valuable during the initial review of the science plan, as well as feedback on the draft document that incorporates public comment. So with that, I would like to thank the DPIIC for their time and conclude by requesting you for continued commitment of the Delta Agency Science Work Group to be involved in and provide guidance on updating and continued joint implementation of the Delta Science Plan. Thank you.
And I presume we have support for that. Okay, great job. Yes, Paul.
Thank you for your work. I've got a question for you about a conversation I was a part of not too long ago. We were discussing the fact that IEP was developing its work plan for the year. I think it's getting close to being done. And the question that was raised was, how does the effort that we're talking about now relate to IEP's work plan?
So we view the Delta Science Plan as sort of a high-level strategy for, and really we've taken sort of a 5-year look at what should we be trying to achieve on a strategic level. I think when it gets down to work plans, it's a little bit more specific about specific things that are within the purview of an individual sort of collaborative groups or sort of individual programs purview. We're trying to be a little bit more visionary in the science plan and try to think out collectively across the range of policy issues that you all represent. How do we make progress on science within that framework? So I think they're related. I think we see the science plan as something that can guide work plans, and that certainly should bring in and fold in the perspectives of those various groups.
Paul, if I may add to that too, just with one example. So from the Science Enterprise Workshop, we talked a lot about sort of these fundamental components of what makes a science enterprise. One of the examples they talked about is the appendices in the science plan that were updated last year or two. And one of those appendices talks about the role of peer review workshops or independent review workshops and panels. So that's one of these sort of fundamental components of what it means to have a science enterprise. We had talked about it a year ago at the Science Enterprise Workshop. So having a Delta Science Plan that we can use for other agencies to sort of review and refer back to that process, but also sort of sets up these larger components of a science infrastructure that really supports the entire community. So I think that's one component of it.
Yes.
So
Carl.
I think, to Paul's comment, IEP has its annual work plan, but it also has a science strategy and a science plan that looks out 5 years. And I think the question before us is within the context of the Delta Plan and what's going on with IEP, other science programs, and the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program. How do those pieces fit together? And from my perspective, and this is what, a number of us that are looking at the adaptive management program that's tied to the biological opinions, how do these pieces fit together into that overall strategy, and what is part of the adaptive management plan for the BIOPS and the CESA authorizations, and how does that relate to the broader science, the higher level science that the Delta Science program represents, and the broader kind of perspectives, and how do we bring those together and integrate them? So I think that's kind of the challenge before us in the coming year, is how do we fit all those pieces together?
So I think I could say for the Delta Science Plan, I think maybe that will be one specific issue that clearly has risen to people's attention and interest that we'll probably incorporate. So as we develop the science plan, we will be not just using the existing science plan, but getting as much input as we can to see what are the things that we don't have in the science plan now that we should incorporate. One thing we know we don't have is some consideration of climate change issues, and so that's one thing we've been aware of that we need to really incorporate more into the science plan. But those other specific coordination issues, I think, are the kinds of things that we feel. I don't think we will be identifying what the IEP should do, but we will be trying to identify how to facilitate coordination across IEP, across CAMP, across all these multiple existing programs to make them work together in a more collaborative sense.
Sure, and thank you for those comments, and I think that we recognize that those are outstanding questions and should definitely be addressed as part of the update to the science plan to describe those relationships, and something that we're committed to working with your staff to be able to better describe in the science plan.
One of my goals for the meeting is that everybody participates. So Mike, you've completed one of my goals by volunteering to make a comment or ask a question.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to be the anchor person. So, and this is really riffing off of the dialogue that Paul started with this comment about the relationship between the IEP and the Science Action Agenda. Taken together, the CSAMP, the IEP, and some other programs constitute the substance of the science agenda for our enterprise. So, as Carl says, working out the relationship among those parts is going to be a priority going forward. I want to add that there's another aspect to achieving One Delta, One Science that hasn't come up in this discussion, and that is the cultural factors. There are really cultural, historical issues that stand in the way. They have to do with the way that people collaborate with one another, the way that we engage stakeholders in science. It seems to me that you have an opportunity to address those issues, to paint something of a broad brush roadmap to addressing some of those other issues, the non-substantive issues that probably need to be addressed in order to get to One Delta, One Science. So I hope you're thinking about how you're going to do that.
Okay, Paul?
Just one more thought. I think it's a great idea to look across these different efforts and make sure they're connected. And I think it's in all of our interest to be able to tell that story in 20 minutes or less. I've gotten a lot of interest from outside of the government on wanting to have some input into science priorities, and that's perfectly fair and legitimate. And I'll raise my hand, I should know better, but I'm not sure quite how to facilitate that now. And I've seen in my career over time, people start asking questions about science investments. Are they the right priority? Are we spending money on the right things? And that is fundamentally the place of a policymaker informed by science. So I just think it would be in our interest to tell this story a little better than we have, because I'm getting lots of questions about it.
I'll also bring up two things that the Independent Science Board is addressing currently in their reviews is a review of the monitoring enterprise within the entire Delta. So they're putting together an inventory of all the, they'll be working with people to put together an inventory of all of the monitoring that's going on within the Delta, who's doing it, what management questions are being addressed, and how it could be coordinated in a more effective way. So that will probably take a year or more for the Independent Science Board to develop, but I think that will be very informative for those coordination issues. And then separately, they are doing a programmatic review of IEP itself, of what more of the governance issues and structure of IEP, what some of the strengths and weaknesses are in that regard. So those two reviews, I think, should be helpful in addressing some of the issues that have been pointed out.
Carl?
So just as a follow-up to Paul's point, I think it's the essential point that, we need a plan that we can point to that's clearly any one of us can say, this is how the issue is addressed. And we can't do that right now. We do all kinds of stuff, collect all kinds of information, but we're constantly confronted with somebody with a different idea, and we need to lay out what the approach is going to be for whatever the management topic is to inform ultimate decision-making through the adaptive management process. And, I think sooner than later is when we need to get that done.
Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? All right. That concludes agenda item number 3. John, thank you for facilitating that.
Thank you.
Yumiko and Lindsay, thank you very much for all your work in the presentations today. That brings us to agenda item 4, any committee business. I would point out that the next scheduled meeting is April 16th. And if there is nothing further you wish to discuss, then I want to thank each and every one of you for attending, for your participation. I want to thank Jessica again for your work with our staff in organizing this. For those of you that have patiently sat for 4 hours plus in the audience or have watched on the web broadcast, we thank you too for your interest. And the work continues. Look forward to working with you in partnership in the future. Thank you. Meeting adjourned.